Hey there, friends! Tonight's tale is not a love story. Not unless your idea of romance involves cattle negotiations, 12-year-old brides, and absolutely no say in who you spend the rest of your life with. We're heading back to the muddy paths and candlelit halls of medieval Europe. Not to hear about courtly love or fairy tale weddings, but to explore what marriage really looked like in the Middle Ages. Spoiler alert, it wasn't great. In fact, it kind of sucked. This story is about arranged unions, power imbalances, and what happened when love had very little to do with it. Now, before we start, go ahead and like this video if you enjoy these slow, softly spoken history rambles designed to help you drift off while secretly learning something strange. And if you're new here, welcome to the village. Tap subscribe and settle in for weekly stories that are boring on purpose and soothing by design. And let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight? What's the time where you are? Are you curled up under a blanket, sipping tea, munching something cozy, or just staring at the ceiling, hoping your brain power's down soon? Whatever the case, let it be quiet now. Dim the lights. Let the rustle of blankets, the hum of a fan, or the hush of night settle around you. Take a deep breath. And let's go back to a time when marriage wasn't made in heaven. It was arranged in a muddy yard, over bread, coins, and maybe a goat or two. This is the story of why marriage in medieval times sucked. Let's begin. It begins not with a glance across a crowded feast hall or a whispered confession by torchlight, but with land. In the world of medieval marriage, romance rarely entered the room. If it did, it stood quietly in the corner, ignored, uninvited, irrelevant, because marriage, more often than not, was not a matter of the heart. It was a matter of soil. To be married in the Middle Ages was to be part of an economic transaction. It wasn't about choosing the one who made your heart race. It was about choosing the one whose family owned the right field, or the mill by the stream, or whose cousin was in good standing with the bishop. Love, if it showed up at all, came after contracts were signed, dowries were exchanged, and cattle were counted. Families looked at land the way merchants looked at coin, something to preserve, protect, and pass down. And nothing threatened that more than an impractical marriage. You didn't marry for passion. You married for power, for position, for property. A good match meant keeping estates intact, joining resources, or climbing ever so slightly up the fragile ladder of feudal society. For nobility, the stakes were higher still. A well-arranged marriage could mean the difference between war and peace, loyalty or rebellion. Peasant families may not have held titles, but they still understood the stakes. Even a simple plot of workable land could feed future generations, or ruin them. So fathers brokered deals, mothers calculated inheritances. Children, especially daughters, became pieces in a long game of survival. A marriage wasn't the start of a love story, it was the closing act of a negotiation. And the thing they were negotiating most often? Dirt. Acres, boundaries that weren't marked by fences but by streams, stones, or the stretch of a plough's reach. Marriage was a legal tool to lock that land into the family line. Feelings were not required. There were exceptions, of course, lovers who ran off, unions forged in secret, but these were rare and often punished. Because when you married poorly, when you married for want instead of wealth, you risked the very foundation of your family's future. Property didn't just trump passion. It replaced it entirely. Even the church, for all its talk of divine blessing and holy union, often turned a blind eye to the reality that most marriages were made not by hearts but by hands signing deals, often while the bride stood silent nearby. Especially among the landed classes, marriages were tools, means to an end. And in that end was stability, control, inheritance. A daughter's value was often measured not by her charm or kindness, but by what land or wealth she brought with her. Her dowry wasn't a gift, it was leverage, and the more leverage she had, the more desirable the match. Not for her sake, but for the men shaking hands across the firelit table. There's a quiet sadness to it all. Two young people, perhaps barely grown, standing side by side, not because they chose one another, but because someone else had chosen for them. And behind them, invisible but heavy, was land, ancestral land, promised land. A handful of earth determining the shape of their lives. So as we drift deeper into this story, remember this. Medieval marriage didn't begin with a kiss. It began with a calculation, a ledger, a line drawn between fields, Because in the end, land didn't just support life, it shaped love, or more often replaced it. During this time, marriage was not a union between two individuals based on love, companionship, or mutual interests. It was, more often than not, a financial transaction, and the dowry was its centerpiece. A dowry, money, goods, land, or livestock provided by a bride's family was the price of entry into the institution of marriage. It functioned as a bargaining chip, a safety net, and a statement of worth. And in almost every case, it mattered more than the personality, health, education, or feelings of the bride herself. Among noble families, the dowry could be vast and politically significant. Large sums of money, titles, estates, or even entire villages might be transferred as part of a marriage arrangement. These dowries weren't seen as gifts, but as strategic tools. They secured alliances, settled disputes, and preserved family power across generations. The girl at the centre of it all was often young, barely literate, and had no meaningful say in the arrangement being made on her behalf. In the peasant classes, dowries were smaller, but just as critical. A cow, a few chickens, a sack of grain, or a bolt of wool could be enough to settle a marriage agreement between two families. Even here, the principle was the same. The bride's family had to provide something of value in exchange for her placement in another household. If they couldn't, the marriage might not happen at all, or the bride might be married to someone older, poorer, or socially inferior, simply because there were no better options without a stronger dowry. The presence or absence of a dowry directly affected a woman's prospects. A girl with a substantial dowry had a better chance at marrying someone of equal or slightly higher status. A girl without one could be overlooked entirely, or forced into a marriage with someone far older, more desperate, or less desirable. The logic was cold, but widely accepted. A marriage without a dowry was a burden. A marriage with a dowry was an investment. In theory, the dowry served a protective function for the bride. If her husband died or abandoned her, the dowry could be reclaimed or used to support her. Some legal systems across medieval Europe included provisions for the return of the dowry or a portion of it under certain circumstances, but in practice, recovering a dowry was difficult. Widows or abandoned wives often lacked the resources or legal standing to pursue their claims, especially if the husband's family contested them. In urban areas and among merchant families, dowries played an increasingly complicated role. As cities grew and commerce expanded, money-based dowries became common. A merchant might offer a large sum of coin or commercial goods to secure his daughter's marriage to a rising tradesman or artisan. In such cases, daughters could become vital assets in growing a family's wealth and reputation. Again, the emphasis was not on the girl's desires or preferences, but on how well her dowry could be leveraged for economic advancement. Over time, the competition for suitable matches created a kind of dowry inflation. Families went into debt or sold off property to secure favourable marriages for their daughters. In some regions, particularly in Renaissance Italy, unmarried women were placed in convents not because of religious calling, but because their families could not afford the dowries needed to marry them off. Marriage, or the lack thereof, became directly tied to economics. For men, the equation was simpler. A groom was not expected to bring a dowry. In some cases, especially in wealthier or royal marriages, he might provide a bride price or mourning gift, a symbolic gesture of his ability to support his new wife. But these were often token amounts and paled in comparison to what the bride's family was expected to deliver. The dowry system effectively commodified women. Their value was not determined by who they were, but by what they brought with them. Education, kindness, intelligence, or even beauty were secondary to the number of goats, the size of the land, or the weight of the coin involved. In this system, personal desire was irrelevant. Romantic love, if it developed at all, came after the transaction had been completed. Most never had that luxury. The dowry ensured that marriage remained, first and foremost, a tool for preserving wealth and hierarchy, not a bond between equals. And for millions of medieval women, it meant their lives were shaped more by what they carried into a marriage than by who they were within it. In medieval Europe, marriage was not merely a private affair. It was a public contract, carefully negotiated, recorded, and enforced. Far from being the culmination of courtship or emotional connection, the marital bond was, at its core, a legal agreement between two families. The individuals getting married were often treated more as signatures than participants. Contracts formed the backbone of most marriages, particularly among the nobility, merchant classes, and wealthier peasants. In many cases, betrothal contracts were drawn up months or even years before the actual marriage took place. These documents were precise, outlining not only the dowry and inheritance terms, but also the obligations of each party, provisions for children, and what would happen in the event of a death, separation, or breach of agreement. Love, affection, and compatibility had no legal standing in these documents. What mattered were lineage, property, and alliances. A well-structured contract ensured that land remained in the family, that debts were avoided, and that political or social ties were strengthened. Marriage was less about two people joining together, and more about two lineages forming a calculated bond. Among the aristocracy, marriage contracts were often tied to inheritance law. Noble families used marriage to consolidate power, expand their holdings, and secure loyalty. A marriage might be arranged to end a feud, secure a truce, or bind two rival houses together. Entire regions shifted hands because of strategic marriage contracts, and children, especially daughters, were promised off as tools of diplomacy. There are numerous recorded cases where children were formally betrothed before the age of 10 and married before puberty, all under the authority of carefully signed contracts. These arrangements were typically handled by the heads of families, not the individuals being married. A father, uncle, or elder brother might negotiate terms on a young girl's behalf, often without ever consulting her. In many regions, a girl could be legally married by the age of 12, and a boy at 14, provided the contract was sound and agreed upon by her guardian. Although church law technically required consent from both parties, in practice consent was presumed, especially if the contract had been signed and the dowry delivered. In the merchant and urban classes, contracts focused more on economic terms. Wealthy families ensured that goods, businesses, and real estate were protected and transferred according to very specific guidelines. These agreements were often notarized or witnessed by local officials or clergy. Once signed, they were legally binding, and breaking them could result in financial penalties or social disgrace. In peasant communities, formal written contracts were less common, but the principles still applied. Local customs, spoken agreements, and community witnesses played the same role as documents. Even here, marriage was a public structured act governed by expectations of work, land use, inheritance, and reputation. A man might agree to take on his wife's family's debts or farming duties, while the bride's family promised labour, tools, or livestock in return. Again, affection played little part. The church's role in all of this was complicated. Officially by the 12th century, canon law defined marriage as a sacrament requiring the free and mutual consent of both parties. But the church also recognised the binding nature of betrothal contracts and dowry exchanges. In practice, the church often turned a blind eye to the lack of real consent, especially if the marriage served political or social order. As long as the contract was valid and the marriage consummated, it was considered legitimate. Moreover, love itself was often viewed with suspicion. Romantic attachment, especially outside the bounds of a formally contracted marriage, was seen as dangerous or subversive. Courtly love, as idealized in poetry, was often celebrated precisely because it was not about real marriage. It was fantasy, rebellion, or escapism. Actual marriage was duty, not desire. The result was a system where individuals, especially women, had very limited control over their marital fate. Once the contract was signed and the arrangements made, there was little room for protest. A woman might spend her life bound to a man she barely knew, or worse, someone significantly older or uninterested in her well-being, because that was what had been agreed on at the table where she had no seat. In this world, marriage was not the beginning of a shared life rooted in love. It was the result of a legal and financial negotiation, one often conducted without regard for the emotional, psychological, or even physical welfare of the people involved. This was not love, it was logistics. The institution of marriage functioned within a transactional framework where women were treated less as autonomous individuals and more as economic assets. This mindset, deeply entrenched across all social classes, meant that a bride's value was not based on her personality, intelligence, or potential contributions as a partner, but on her utility within a financial and social equation. The previous chapter discussed the contractual nature of marriage, where legal documents and negotiations determined the shape of marital unions. At the centre of those contracts was a simple and enduring assumption. A woman had worth only insofar as she could bring resources, labour, or advantageous connections into the household she was entering. This reality manifested most clearly in two financial concepts, the dowry and the bride price. While the dowry, property or wealth given by the bride's family to the groom or his household, was more common in Christian Europe, especially in Western regions, the concept of a bride price also existed in various forms, particularly in earlier medieval periods or in non-Christian communities within the broader medieval world. In both systems, the underlying principle was the same. Women were assets to be exchanged. Their movement from one household to another involved the transfer of wealth, and the nature of that transfer reinforced their subordinate position. A daughter with a large dowry could elevate her family's status, cement political alliances, or unlock new economic opportunities. Conversely, a daughter with no dowry was a liability, her marriage prospects limited, her value diminished, and her fate more uncertain. In many cases, noble families treated daughters like currency. They were part of broader strategies to secure territorial claims, forge alliances, or consolidate influence. Kings arranged marriages for political convenience, often with no regard for age, compatibility, or even geographic proximity. A young princess could be married off to a distant ruler in a land she had never seen, expected to produce heirs and serve as a living symbol of unity between powers. The choice was rarely hers. Among the lower classes, the system was less elaborate but no less transactional. A father might secure his daughter's future and relieve himself of the financial burden of supporting her by marrying her off to a man who agreed to certain terms, to assume debts, to work the land, to take her into his household in exchange for livestock or grain. The bride's presence alone did not carry value. It was what she came with that mattered. This commodification of women had long-term consequences. It shaped not only the circumstances of their marriages, but also their position within those marriages. A woman who had been bought through a bride price or heavily bargained over in a dowry negotiation was often viewed as property, an extension of a transaction rather than a partner in a union. Her labour, particularly in agricultural or domestic settings, was expected, uncelebrated, and unpaid. Her reproductive role was emphasised, especially if her ability to bear sons could secure her husband's lineage or inheritance. Legal structures reinforced this position. A husband had broad rights over his wife's body, labour and movements. In most regions, she could not own property independently, enter contracts, or make legal claims without her husband's involvement. In cases of abuse, abandonment, or neglect, recourse was limited, especially if her dowry had already been absorbed into the husband's estate. Even in widowhood, a woman's value continued to be framed by economic terms. A widowed woman might regain some control over her dowry, depending on the region's laws and whether provisions had been written into the marriage contract. But more commonly, widows were expected to remarry quickly, especially if they had young children or lacked independent wealth. A new marriage would once again be arranged around property and labour, not personal agency. This framework persisted for centuries and was rarely challenged, in part because it was so deeply woven into both secular and religious ideologies. The Church, while upholding marriage as a sacrament, did little to protect women from the realities of economic objectification. Its primary concern was the legitimacy of unions and the stability of Christian households, not the equity of those within them. Thus, the concept of a bride price, literal or symbolic, served to reinforce a society in which women were rarely seen as full participants in the marital bond. They were passed from one household to another, appraised like livestock, and absorbed into systems designed to preserve wealth, not foster affection. Marriage in the medieval world, for all its ceremony and sacred language, was rarely about mutual respect or emotional connection. It was about value, and that value for women was measured in coin, cattle, and what they could offer, not who they were. Unions were rarely the result of individual choice. Instead, they were a decision made by families, especially fathers, who negotiated matches for strategic, financial, or social gain. Whether noble or peasant, male or female, most people in medieval Europe had little say in who they married. The system of arranged marriage was not just common, it was expected. As explored in the previous chapter, marriage functioned as a transaction in which women were treated as assets. But even beyond the issue of dowries and bride prices, the core reality remained the same. Marriage was arranged by others. Consent, when it was given at all, was usually symbolic or coerced. Actual agency was extremely limited, especially for young women. Among the nobility, arranged marriages were often formalised early. Betrothals could be arranged when children were as young as 6 or 7. These agreements, usually sealed by formal contracts, were legally binding and socially reinforced. The intent wasn't companionship, but alliance. A father might agree to marry his daughter to the son of a neighbouring lord to consolidate land or form a military bond. In some cases, entire peace treaties were built around the marriage of 2 children who hadn't even reached adolescence. The practice was so ingrained in aristocratic life that even kings and queens had little personal choice. Royal marriages were geopolitical tools. A young princess might be married off to a distant ruler to form a diplomatic alliance, even if she had never seen his face. She would travel to a foreign court, speak a new language, and bear children for a dynasty not her own, all because her father and advisers had considered it politically advantageous. For the merchant and peasant classes, the same logic applied on a smaller scale. Marriages were still arranged by parents or guardians with an eye toward practical outcomes. A prosperous blacksmith might seek a bride for his son from a miller's family, hoping to connect 2 trades. A farming family might offer a daughter to the neighbouring tenant in exchange for shared land use or future inheritance. In rural areas, arrangements were often informal but equally binding. There might not be a written contract, but everyone understood the expectations. A handshake between fathers, a verbal promise before witnesses, or the transfer of a few goods could serve as the foundation for a lifelong commitment. Once the agreement was made, backing out could bring shame to both families, especially to the woman, whose value was tied to her perceived virtue and reliability. Young people, particularly girls, had limited means to protest. Social pressure was immense, and disobedience was rare. Daughters were expected to obey their fathers and later their husbands. Refusing a marriage could result in punishment, estrangement, or being sent to a convent, an option that, while seemingly peaceful, was often a place for unwanted daughters rather than devoted spiritual aspirants. In theory, the medieval church emphasised consent in marriage. Canon law required that both parties agree to the union, and by the 12th century, this notion had become doctrinal. But in reality, enforcement was inconsistent. Consent could be coerced, presumed, or entirely fabricated. As long as the marriage appeared orderly and the community approved, the church usually did not intervene. It's also worth noting that in some cases, consent was deliberately manipulated. A daughter might be presented with a choice that wasn't really a choice at all: marry the man selected for her, or face poverty, dishonour, or forced religious life. A verbal yes under these conditions carried little meaning. For boys, the pressure was different, but still real. Sons were expected to marry women who could strengthen the family's wealth or labour force. Their preferences might carry slightly more weight, especially in small households, but they too were often steered firmly toward advantageous matches. A son who disobeyed or married beneath his station could be disinherited or removed from the family business. The social structures that supported arranged marriages reinforced by law, religion, and economics. Marriage was seen not as a personal journey, but as a necessary step toward maintaining social order. A well-arranged marriage brought stability. A poorly arranged or unauthorised one risked scandal. Thus, for most medieval people, especially women, marriage wasn't about attraction, connection, or shared values. It was about being chosen, not by your future spouse, but by your parents, guardians, or elders. And once they shook hands, your future was no longer your own. Although church doctrine from the 12th century onward insisted that marriage required the free and mutual consent of both parties, The lived reality in medieval Europe was far more complicated, especially for those who were young, female, or socially powerless. The concept of consent existed, but its practical application was riddled with inconsistencies, loopholes, and cultural norms that often rendered it meaningless. As previously discussed, arranged marriages were the norm. Parents or guardians negotiated the match, and once terms were agreed upon, the young couple was expected to comply. Officially, the church required verbal consent from both individuals to validate a marriage. This was a reform meant to distinguish Christian marriage from older Roman and tribal customs that prioritized family arrangements over personal agreement. However, enforcement of this standard was uneven at best. For young girls in particular, consent was a formality that could be presumed, pressured, or outright fabricated. Girls as young as 12 were legally permitted to marry under canon law, while boys could marry at 14. In practice, betrothals were often arranged even earlier, with the understanding that the children would marry once they reached the appropriate age. But many girls had little understanding of what marriage entailed, and even less power to resist it. When a girl's father or guardian accepted a marriage proposal, her refusal, if voiced at all, was often dismissed as disobedience or immaturity. In a patriarchal system that equated obedience with virtue, saying no was both socially and spiritually discouraged. Parents, clergy, and community elders expected girls to comply with decisions made on their behalf. As a result, many so-called consensual marriages were little more than coerced compliance masked as agreement. Moreover, the methods of obtaining consent were not always ethical. In some cases, girls were asked in front of family members or religious officials whether they agreed to the marriage. The pressure to affirm the arrangement in such a public setting, combined with the threat of shame or punishment, made refusal extremely difficult. Even if a girl hesitated or expressed doubt, these were often interpreted as shyness or reluctance rather than genuine dissent. Legal recourse for those who were forced into marriage was minimal. While some ecclesiastical courts did annul marriages based on lack of consent, these cases were rare, expensive, and required the support of influential individuals. For peasant families or lower-ranking members of the nobility, pursuing annulment was usually out of reach. Most people lacked the education, resources, or connections to challenge a marriage once it had been formalized, especially if it had been consummated. Compounding the issue was the belief that consummation effectively ratified consent. Even if a marriage had been arranged under dubious circumstances, the act of sexual union was often taken as proof of agreement. This created a system where physical vulnerability, especially for young brides, could erase any legal objections to the match. The moment a girl became sexually involved with her husband, even under pressure or fear, the marriage was almost impossible to contest. It is important to note that boys, though they held more social power than girls, were not immune to this system. In noble or royal families, young boys were often married off to secure dynastic alliances or inheritances. While they were more likely to have access to education or influence, they too could be married against their will, particularly if it served the interests of the family. However, the consequences of resistance were generally less severe for boys than for girls. A boy who disobeyed might be reprimanded or disinherited. A girl who refused could face social ruin, isolation, or confinement. Consent was also complicated by issues of class and legal status. Servants, serfs, and those in bonded labour positions had even fewer rights when it came to marital decisions. A noble or landowning family could pressure a peasant girl into marriage as a form of debt repayment or labour arrangement, and her ability to resist was virtually non-existent. In such contexts, consent was not just complicated, it was functionally irrelevant. Even when marriages were technically consensual, the conditions under which that consent was given were often shaped by structural inequality, familial pressure, and a lack of viable alternatives. In medieval Europe, to refuse marriage was to reject one's only path to social legitimacy and economic survival. Few dared to do it. In theory, medieval marriage law acknowledged the importance of personal agreement. In practice, it was a system that prioritized order, inheritance, and religious sanction over individual will, especially when that will belonged to a young girl. The medieval church played a central role in shaping, regulating, and legitimizing marriage. But despite its doctrinal insistence on mutual consent, it often upheld unions forged through pressure, arrangement, and inequality. In theory, the church was the defender of sacramental marriage, emphasizing the spiritual bond between husband and wife. In practice, however, it functioned as both validator and enforcer of a deeply hierarchical system in which the needs of families, communities, and feudal structures frequently overrode individual will. By the 12th century, the Catholic Church had formally recognized marriage as one of the 7 sacraments. This meant that marriage was not only a legal and social arrangement, but also a spiritual one, instituted by God and governed by religious law. Canon law defined marriage as a permanent monogamous union that required the free and mutual consent of both parties. This was, on paper, a major shift from earlier customs where marriages were arranged entirely by families or clan leaders with no requirement for individual agreement. However, the implementation of this doctrine was inconsistent. In many cases, the Church took a passive role, accepting the reality that families would continue to arrange marriages for their children. If a marriage contract had been agreed upon, a dowry exchanged, and the marriage consummated, it was rarely questioned, regardless of whether either party had consented in a meaningful sense. Clergy were responsible for overseeing and blessing marriages, but they were also closely tied to the communities they served. Local priests were often under pressure to prioritize social stability over spiritual ideals. Questioning a marriage arranged by influential families could cause conflict. More often than not, priests performed their role without investigating whether the union had been freely chosen. In rural areas where record-keeping was minimal and clergy often lacked formal training, there was even less scrutiny. Ecclesiastical courts did occasionally intervene in cases of disputed consent, especially among the elite where such disputes involved property, inheritance, or political consequences. Annulments could be granted if it could be proven that one party was coerced, underage, already married, or related within prohibited degrees of kinship. But these cases were the exception, not the rule, and even when successful, they usually required financial means, influential advocates, or political leverage. For the vast majority of people, particularly women, bringing such a case before the church was virtually impossible. Illiteracy, lack of legal knowledge, and the logistical difficulty of travelling to a church court all acted as barriers. Even when complaints were made, judges often ruled in favour of preserving the marriage, particularly if the union had already been consummated or produced children. The Church's own teachings, while emphasising consent, also reinforced obedience, submission and duty within marriage, particularly on the part of the wife. Religious sermons and texts repeatedly taught that a woman's role in marriage was to obey her husband, maintain the household, and accept her lot in life. Marriage was seen as a remedy for sin, particularly lust, and women were frequently portrayed as needing the guidance and authority of a husband to remain virtuous. This moral framework further undermined any practical ability a woman might have had to resist an unwanted marriage or protest against abuse within one. Additionally, the Church forbade divorce. While separation was allowed in limited cases, usually due to adultery or extreme cruelty, the marriage itself could not be dissolved. Once married, a woman was bound to her husband for life. Remarriage after separation was only permitted if the original marriage was annulled, which again required legal proof and clerical approval. This placed women in especially vulnerable positions, as they had no lawful escape from a damaging or forced marriage unless they could navigate a complex legal and religious system. The Church also supported the idea that marriage was a public and communal institution. Weddings typically took place outside the church building at the church door in full view of the community. This reinforced the idea that marriage was not simply about the couple, but about the families, witnesses, and broader social order. Once the ceremony had been performed and the community had acknowledged the union, it was difficult to challenge or undo it, regardless of personal objections. Ultimately, the Church's involvement in marriage served to sanctify existing social norms rather than challenge them. While canon law introduced the ideal of mutual consent, It rarely protected those whose consent had been manufactured, manipulated, or ignored. Instead, it wrapped the institution of marriage in spiritual authority, granting divine legitimacy to a system where personal freedom was often absent. In effect, the Church said yes on behalf of countless women and girls who never had the chance to say it themselves. The idea of a child being married may seem shocking to modern sensibilities, but in medieval Europe, it was not only accepted, it was legally and socially normalised. Girls were often promised in marriage well before they reached adolescence, with betrothals sometimes arranged in infancy. In a world where marriage was treated as a transaction, children, especially daughters, were negotiated over as assets long before they were old enough to comprehend what was happening. This practice was particularly common among the nobility, where the stakes of land ownership, dynastic continuity, and political alliances were especially high. Noble families often arranged betrothals to secure peace treaties, cement strategic relationships, or lock in future inheritances. A girl might be formally betrothed by the age of 5 or 6, with the actual marriage set to take place once she reached the legal minimum age of 12, as defined by canon law. The Church, while recognising 12 as the minimum age for a valid marriage, did not necessarily discourage early betrothal. In fact, it often participated in the ceremonies, blessing the unions and ensuring that families followed the proper spiritual and legal processes. Betrothal agreements could be binding, and breaking them without cause could lead to financial penalties or social scandal. For families, securing a child's future through early arrangement was a responsible and expected act. Among peasants and townspeople, early marriage arrangements were less formal, but still present. Parents might not draft contracts, but they might nonetheless agree, years in advance, that their daughter would marry the neighbour's son, often in exchange for livestock, labour, or other goods. The children involved would be raised with the understanding that they were meant for one another, even if the arrangement served family interests more than personal ones. While the actual marriage ceremony was often delayed until the girl reached physical maturity, the psychological and social weight of these early promises was significant. From an early age, a girl's identity was shaped by her future role as wife. Her education, behaviour, and household responsibilities were all geared toward preparing her for that destiny. Her body and future labour had already been pledged, and few alternatives existed. For many girls, the idea of personal choice in marriage simply never entered the realm of possibility. Even when the marriage itself was delayed, the control over the girl's life began early. Once betrothed, a girl might be sent to live with her future husband's family, especially among the nobility. This practice, known as fostering, was meant to familiarise her with her new household and reinforce the arrangement. It also served to bind the two families more closely together. However, it placed young girls in unfamiliar environments where they held little power, often under the authority of in-laws who already viewed them as future property. For some, particularly among the elite, early marriage could lead to early motherhood. While canon law stated that consummation should only occur once the bride had reached physical maturity, enforcement was weak, and social pressure to produce heirs was strong. Girls as young as 13 or 14 could find themselves pregnant within a year of marriage, facing the physical dangers of childbirth without the benefit of age, support, or understanding. These early marriages also meant that girls had limited time to develop personal identity or skills outside the domestic sphere. Few received education beyond what was needed to manage a household. Literacy, if taught at all, was reserved for religious purposes. Girls were not trained to make decisions or pursue individual goals. They were raised to serve, obey, and fulfill the marital expectations determined by others. In rare cases, a girl might resist or flee in an unwanted marriage, and there are documented examples of ecclesiastical courts granting annulments on the basis of age or lack of consent. But these were exceptions, not norms. Most young brides accepted their fate with little protest, often because they had no frame of reference for an alternative life. It is also important to note that while boys could be married young as well, the consequences were rarely as immediate or life-altering. A 14-year-old boy who married might continue his education, apprenticeship, or military training. He often remained in his father's household and did not assume full responsibility for his wife until years later. For girls, marriage meant immediate transition into adult responsibilities: housekeeping, sexual availability, and childbearing, whether they were prepared or not. In this system, a girl's future could be sealed before she learned to write her name. She was spoken for, pledged, and eventually married into a life that was not of her own making. And from that point on, her role was defined, not by dreams or desires, but by duties she had no choice but to accept. Having explored how many girls entered marriage before they fully understood it, we now arrive at the wedding day itself. A moment modern culture often treats as a celebration of love, beauty, and personal fulfillment. But in the medieval world, weddings were usually far less romantic and far more practical. There were no flowing white gowns, no sparkling rings, and very little attention paid to the emotions of the bride and groom. Instead, medieval weddings, especially among the lower classes, were simple, public, and primarily transactional. The white wedding dress, now considered traditional, is a relatively recent invention. In medieval Europe, brides did not wear white to symbolise purity. That convention became popular only centuries later, after Queen Victoria wore a white gown in 1840. During the Middle Ages, brides wore their best available clothing, whatever they had that was clean, in good condition, and appropriate for the occasion. For wealthier families, this might mean a richly dyed wool or silk dress, often in red, blue, green, or gold. Among the peasantry, the bride's clothing was likely a well-maintained work dress, possibly adorned with a belt or veil if the family could afford it. Colour held symbolic significance in medieval culture, but it was also expensive. Natural dyes were costly and labour-intensive to produce, so brightly coloured garments were a luxury reserved for those who could afford them. A common bride might wear muted browns, greys, or earth tones, whatever was practical and available. In some communities, brides might borrow finer clothing for the ceremony, but this too was dependent on family reputation and resources. Weddings often took place outdoors, typically at the door of the local church. This location was not chosen for aesthetic reasons, but for visibility. Church doors were public spaces, and the community was expected to witness the union. Marriage was not considered a private matter between two people, but a public contract that affected kinship ties, inheritance, and social structure. By conducting the ceremony at the church entrance, it ensured accountability. There would be witnesses, and the union would be recorded by the clergy. The ceremony itself was brief and heavily focused on legal obligations. The priest asked the bride and groom to declare their consent, blessed the union, and in some cases conducted a brief mass afterward. There were no lengthy vows, elaborate processions, or dramatic declarations of love. If a ring was exchanged, it was usually a simple iron or bronze band, and often only worn by the bride. Rings were not expected, nor were they always available or affordable. In many cases, the dowry was considered the true symbol of the union, not any jewellery exchanged during the ceremony. Weddings in medieval Europe also lacked many of the ceremonial features we associate with the modern celebration. There were no wedding cakes, no photographers, no speeches or formal dances. What followed the ceremony might be a shared meal with family and neighbours, if the couple was fortunate and had the means to host one. For noble families, a feast might last several days, but even then, the purpose was more about displaying wealth and securing political alliances than honouring the couple's personal bond. Among commoners, wedding celebrations were modest. A few jugs of ale, bread and stew shared among relatives might be all the celebration they could afford. Gifts, if given, were practical, tools for the household, cloth or food. Joy was present, but subdued. Marriage marked a transition into serious responsibility, particularly for the bride. It meant leaving her family home, taking on domestic labour and preparing for childbirth. There was little time or space for personal sentiment. Even the tone of the day could be sobering. While some communities made room for music, dancing or traditional games, others approached the occasion with quiet formality. The focus was on duty and order, not emotional expression. The bride, especially if young or reluctant, might appear nervous or reserved. Public tears or protests would have been frowned upon as they threatened the appearance of compliance and respectability. The church's role during the wedding reinforced this sombre tone. Priests emphasised the sacramental nature of marriage and the responsibilities it entailed. The couple was reminded that the union was permanent, that fidelity was expected, and that children were its natural purpose. Love, if mentioned at all, came second to discipline, chastity, and obedience. In short, the medieval wedding was not a fairy tale. It was a public contract ratified by religious authority and community oversight. The emphasis was on legality, not affection, on order, not romance. And for many brides, it was the first day of a life they had not chosen, dressed not in white silk but in wool, linen, or whatever else could be spared. The absence of white gowns, flower arrangements, and romantic vows in a medieval wedding was no accident. It reflected a society that prioritised practical outcomes over emotional expression. As such, the symbols exchanged during marriage ceremonies were less about affection and more about economic value, lineage, and obligation. Where modern weddings rely on sentimental gestures, rings, keepsakes, and personal vows, medieval weddings revolved around functional symbolism: livestock, land transfers, dowry exchanges, and visible affirmations of social contract. Though wedding rings are today seen as a near-universal symbol of marriage, their presence in medieval European weddings was far from guaranteed. When rings were used, they were typically plain bands made of inexpensive materials like iron, bronze, or, in wealthier households, silver or gold. In most cases, if a ring was exchanged at all, it was worn only by the bride. The gesture was symbolic of the husband's claim to her, rather than a mutual exchange between equals. Furthermore, rings were not considered essential to the validity of the marriage. The church did not require them, and in poorer communities they were often omitted entirely due to cost or custom. Instead, the binding symbols of marriage were often those with tangible material value. Livestock, grain, land, tools, or even articles of clothing could serve as the more meaningful and certainly more useful representations of the union. For example, in many rural areas, the exchange of livestock was a common and culturally accepted part of a wedding. A bride might arrive at her husband's home with a goat, a pig, or a cow, part of her dowry, but also a symbol of her contribution to the new household's livelihood. These animals were more than property. They represented labour, food, and the ability to generate income. The presence of livestock at a wedding was not decorative. It was deeply practical. In some regions, traditions involved public displays of these dowry goods. Family members and neighbours would witness the handover of animals, chests, or household goods to mark the transfer of wealth and the legitimacy of the marriage. This display served both as legal proof and social reinforcement of the arrangement. The symbolism was clear. This woman enters the marriage not with declarations of love, but with assets. Land, too, played a critical symbolic and economic role. Among noble families, land was often included in the dowry or in the terms of the marriage contract. A bride might bring fields, mills, or income rights to her new husband's estate. In other cases, land was promised to the groom's family upon the birth of an heir. The marriage thus became a symbol not only of union but of strategic consolidation, one that affected political influence, inheritance rights, and power structures for generations. In this environment, symbolic gestures had less to do with romance and more to do with visibility and accountability. The presence of community witnesses, the blessing of the church, the exchange of property, and the public nature of the ceremony all served to ensure that the union was recognised and respected. These elements carried legal and social weight. What mattered most was not the emotion of the couple, but the proper performance of the symbolic exchange that signalled the marriage was valid. There were exceptions, of course. Among wealthier families in urban centres, especially in Italy or France during the later Middle Ages, more ornate tokens such as brooches, rings with engraved messages, or personalised gifts began to appear. These were early signs of a cultural shift toward incorporating personal sentiment into the public act of marriage. But even then, these gestures were often still tied to displays of wealth or social standing, not intimacy. For the vast majority of people, however, wedding symbolism remained rooted in necessity. The items exchanged were meant to sustain a household, prove a contract, or signal the transfer of a woman from one male authority to another. The symbols were real, tangible, and essential, not because they held sentimental value, but because they had immediate utility. In that sense, the medieval wedding was consistent with the rest of married life, grounded in survival, structure, and social expectation. Livestock mattered more than jewellery, grain more than poetry, and public acknowledgement more than private emotion. A medieval bride might not receive a ring, but she might be handed a goat, and in the eyes of her community, that was worth far more. As wedding rings remained optional and livestock frequently took their place as more practical symbols of matrimony, the officiating presence of clergy added another layer of structure, though not necessarily sentiment, to the medieval marriage ceremony. The priest was not there to celebrate love, but to formalize an alliance. The church's role was primarily to regulate, bless, and document the legal and religious components of the union. And while modern weddings might imagine the priest as a warm spiritual guide standing before two people in love, the medieval equivalent was far more administrative. By the 12th century, the Catholic Church had increasingly asserted its authority over marriage, defining it as a sacrament and centralizing its rituals under canon law. However, the Church's interest in overseeing weddings was less about ensuring emotional compatibility and more about ensuring social order. Marriage, in the Church's eyes, was a moral safeguard, an institution designed to legitimize reproduction, reduce sin, and create a stable foundation for Christian society. As such, weddings were structured around obligations, not affection. Clergy officiated weddings to verify the legitimacy of the union and make it publicly binding in the eyes of God and the community. The ceremony was typically held at the church doors, rather than inside the building. This location allowed the event to remain a public declaration, open to witnesses who could confirm the couple's intent to marry. Only after the formal words were spoken and the priest had given his blessing might the couple enter the church for a brief mass or prayer. But even that was optional in many rural parishes. The priest's primary duties during the wedding were procedural. He would confirm that both parties were free to marry, i.e., not already married, not related within prohibited degrees of kinship, and above the minimum age, collect the appropriate fees or offerings, and oversee the exchange of vows and any accompanying goods, whether a dowry, livestock, or other assets. In wealthier parishes, there may have been registers to record the event. In poorer or more isolated communities, the event would be remembered more by the villagers than by written documentation. Importantly, priests did not conduct extensive counselling or assess emotional readiness. Their concern was the legality of the union under church law, not its emotional depth. As long as consent was declared in the proper form, the marriage was valid. Whether the bride or groom felt coerced, reluctant, or confused was often ignored, particularly if the families involved were influential or respected. In fact, clergy were frequently caught in the tension between church doctrine and community expectations. Canon law required mutual consent, but in practice, the priest rarely questioned the circumstances leading up to the ceremony. If both parties spoke the required vows and the marriage was consummated, the church would rarely intervene, even in cases where consent had been manufactured through pressure or deception. For noble or merchant families, priests also served a vital legal function by witnessing the terms of marriage contracts. These agreements outlined the dowry, property rights, inheritance expectations, and what each party was owed should the marriage end in widowhood or separation. The priest might bless the union as sacred, but everyone involved understood that the most important aspect of the ceremony was the preservation and formalization of family assets. Clergy also reinforced the hierarchical nature of the marital relationship. Sermons and church teachings emphasized that the husband was the head of the household and that the wife's duty was to obey, bear children, and remain chaste and loyal. The wedding ceremony often included language underscoring these roles. The church did not encourage emotional equality, but spiritual discipline and moral order. This made the ceremony not just a legal transaction, but a religious one that reaffirmed the social structure of the broader Christian community. Even the blessings offered by priests were primarily concerned with fertility and fidelity. Prayers focused on the couple's ability to produce children, avoid sin, and serve their household faithfully. Love might be mentioned, but as a distant virtue, secondary to duty and reproduction. After the priest's blessing and any accompanying liturgical acts, his role in the marriage was largely complete, unless future disputes arose. The marriage moved from the jurisdiction of the church to the home, where it became the responsibility of the families and, in particular, the husband. The priest had blessed the contract, affirmed the bargain, and now stepped back, having fulfilled his role as spiritual witness to a deeply pragmatic affair. In medieval Europe, the clergy's presence at weddings did not elevate them into romantic celebrations. It simply reinforced that the transaction taking place was sacred in form, if not in feeling. Once the ceremony was complete and the church had given its official blessing, a medieval wedding typically transitioned into a celebration. But like the rest of the marriage process, this celebration was less focused on the couple themselves and more about the families, their social standing, and the successful conclusion of a transaction. If there was a feast, it was not a personal or emotional affair. It was a public event, a practical gathering with deeply social and economic undertones. In noble and royal households, wedding feasts could be elaborate, often lasting several days. These events were not meant to celebrate romantic union, but to display wealth, reinforce alliances, and impress peers or rivals. Hosting a grand feast was a political act, signalling the family's power and influence. Guests expected a display of abundance: roasted meats, wine, fine bread, musicians, and entertainment. The larger the dowry, or more important the match, the greater the scale of the festivities. Even in these upper-class settings, the bride and groom were not necessarily the focus. The fathers of both families, the negotiators, often received more attention than the couple themselves. It was common for political discussions, future arrangements, and family alliances to dominate the banquet. The couple might sit at a central table, but the day belonged to the families who had orchestrated the union. For the merchant and artisan classes, wedding celebrations were smaller but still served a social function. A modest feast might be held in the family home or a rented hall, attended by local guild members, neighbours, and extended kin. Food was shared, toasts made, and occasionally gifts exchanged, but the central theme was still the joining of two households, not a romantic partnership. Among peasants, wedding feasts were far more modest, often limited to what the families could afford. A small meal of bread, ale, and stew might be shared among close relatives and neighbours. If a pig had been slaughtered or a cask of ale set aside, it could mark a rare moment of abundance. In some regions, local customs included folk dances, songs, or symbolic rituals, such as tying hands together with cloth or sharing a communal cup. But these traditions were communal in nature, not focused on celebrating the couple's emotional bond. Regardless of class, the structure of the wedding feast reinforced the idea that marriage was a public institution. It was not meant to reflect private love or intimacy, but rather a successful alliance that benefited both families and, ideally, the wider community. Guests attended not out of affection for the couple, but to witness, affirm, and participate in the social contract that had been enacted. Seating arrangements, food portions, and who gave gifts to whom were all steeped in custom and status. In noble households, guests were often seated according to rank, and meals were served in courses with clear distinctions between higher status and lower status attendees. Music, when present, followed courtly traditions and rarely reflected the preferences of the bride and groom. It was performance, not personalisation. In rural villages, wedding celebrations might include community traditions that blurred the lines between blessing and burden. For example, in some places, it was customary to escort the bride to her new home in a noisy, chaotic procession, sometimes involving jokes, mock rituals, or even symbolic pranks meant to mark the transition. While festive, these acts also served to publicly demonstrate that the bride was leaving one family and joining another. Again, the emphasis was not on love, but on change, status, and structure. After the feast, the couple's public role diminished quickly. In most cases, they were escorted to their new home, or in some customs to their marital bed, by family members and witnesses. The consummation of the marriage, especially in noble circles, could be a public matter as well. Though not always explicitly observed, it was expected to occur immediately, and in some traditions, the sheets or garments associated with it were inspected or displayed afterward. These customs served as final confirmation that the marriage had been properly completed in both legal and physical terms. The following day, life resumed quickly. There was no extended honeymoon or quiet time for the couple to get to know one another. For the bride, particularly, marriage marked the start of immediate domestic responsibilities: cooking, cleaning, managing a household, and preparing for pregnancy. Whatever celebration had taken place was now over. The business of marriage had begun. Thus, while the wedding feast may have included laughter, music, and food, its purpose remained consistent with the rest of the process: to solidify agreements, uphold tradition, and reinforce community norms. For many couples, especially young brides, the wedding celebration was not a moment of joy, but a highly structured ritual with little space for personal sentiment. After the final crumbs of the wedding feast had been cleared and the community returned to its daily routines, the newly married couple faced a reality that, more often than not, exposed a glaring imbalance: the significant age gap between husband and wife. While men typically entered marriage in their mid to late 20s, often after establishing their trade, inheriting land, or completing military obligations, girls were frequently married in early adolescence, sometimes shortly after reaching the legal minimum age of 12. This discrepancy created a dynamic in which many brides were still children in every practical sense, while their husbands were fully grown adults. The reasons behind this age disparity were largely economic and social. Men were expected to prove their ability to support a household before marrying. For most, this meant years of labour, whether in farming, craftsmanship, or military service, before they could afford to take a wife and maintain a family. Land and inheritance played a crucial role as well. In societies governed by primogeniture or other forms of land partitioning, younger sons often had to wait for land to become available, either through family arrangements or external opportunity. As a result, men commonly delayed marriage until they were economically stable. Women, on the other hand, were not expected to contribute financially in the same way. Their primary social value in the marriage equation lay in their reproductive potential and their labour within the household. Because female fertility was closely associated with youth, and because controlling a girl's reproductive future was essential to managing family lineage and inheritance, families sought to marry off daughters at the earliest acceptable age. In many regions of medieval Europe, this meant arranging marriages for girls between the ages of 12 and 16. This led to a common and often jarring pattern: adult men marrying girls who were not yet fully grown, emotionally mature, or physically prepared for the responsibilities of marriage. The result was not just an age gap, but an enormous power imbalance. The older husband typically held control over property, decisions, and behaviour, while the young bride entered the marriage with little experience, no authority, and limited legal protections. In some cases, marriages between older men and young girls were postponed in terms of consummation. There are records of betrothed girls being sent to live with their husband's family to begin the transition, with consummation delayed until the girl reached physical maturity. However, this was not guaranteed, and in many instances, consummation occurred immediately after marriage, regardless of the bride's age or readiness. For girls in this position, marriage was not only a major life transition, it was often a complete loss of childhood. Once wed, a girl was expected to take on adult responsibilities immediately, managing the household, producing children, and serving her husband. There was no period of adjustment or gradual entry into adulthood. Marriage marked an abrupt and irreversible change, often before the girl had the capacity to make informed choices or understand the full scope of her obligations. This dynamic was particularly acute in noble and royal families, where early marriages were used to solidify alliances. Historical records are filled with examples of girls married off before puberty to much older men for political advantage. While consummation might be delayed in theory, these girls were still removed from their homes, placed in unfamiliar environments, and subjected to immense social pressure. Their husbands, often decades older, held not only legal authority, but full control over their movements, associations, and future. Among the lower classes, the age gap was sometimes less extreme, particularly in communities where resources were limited and marriage required practical readiness. Still, the underlying expectations remained. Men were the heads of households, and women, often much younger, were subordinate partners. Age alone could be used to reinforce this hierarchy. The older husband's wisdom and experience were contrasted with the young bride's inexperience and obedience. Importantly, the age gap reinforced the lack of agency women experienced in marriage. A teenage girl married to a man in his 30s or 40s had little hope of asserting independence or negotiating the terms of her role. She was entering a pre-structured relationship in which her youth was not an impediment, but a feature, something that made her easier to manage, mould, and control. This system was not universally challenged. It was embedded in social norms, legal structures, and religious expectations. Girls were praised for obedience and chastity, not for autonomy or maturity. As a result, marriages that today would be recognised as deeply unequal were accepted, sanctioned, and even celebrated. For many girls, marriage did not mark the beginning of adulthood. It abruptly ended their childhood. And for their older husbands, the age gap was not seen as a flaw, but as a form of stability and control within a household shaped by tradition and hierarchy. The significant age gap between husbands and wives in medieval marriages was not only common, it was central to the structure and function of the household. These unions, often formed between adolescent girls and adult men, embedded a distinct and intentional power imbalance from the start. The difference in age translated into differences in authority, legal status, experience, and control, producing marriages where the husband held nearly all decision-making power and the wife's role was largely passive, subordinate, and defined by obedience. In theory, Christian marriage was supposed to be a partnership. The Church described marriage as a union between two souls, ordained by God, with mutual responsibilities and obligations. Sermons and religious texts encouraged husbands to treat their wives with kindness and fairness. However, these ideals often conflicted with the legal and cultural norms that defined marriage in practice. In reality, the older husband was viewed not just as the head of the household, but as a paternal figure, protector, and disciplinarian. This role was reinforced by the age difference. The husband was typically in his late 20s or 30s, old enough to have completed training, inherited land or tools, and developed a stable position in the community. His wife, by contrast, was often in her early teens, with no experience of the world beyond her family home and little understanding of her legal or social rights. This disparity placed the husband in the role of teacher and authority figure from the moment the marriage began. He was expected to instruct his wife in her duties, correct her behaviour, and make decisions on her behalf. While medieval households were cooperative in many ways, wives often worked alongside husbands in agriculture, craft production, or market exchange. Decision-making power remained in the hands of the man. In legal matters, financial dealings and disputes, the husband's word carried more weight. The wife's youth also limited her ability to resist mistreatment or neglect. Physical abuse was not only common, but often legally permissible. In many regions, a husband had the right to chastise his wife, meaning he could physically discipline her without fear of prosecution, as long as it did not cause permanent injury or death. This right was often interpreted loosely, and enforcement was rare. A young wife, dependent on her husband for survival, had few options if she found herself in a violent or coercive marriage. In addition to physical dominance, the older husband held full control over the household's resources. Wives rarely had access to property in their own names. Even dowries, which legally were supposed to remain a woman's personal property, were often absorbed into the household and controlled by the husband. This financial dependency further restricted a wife's ability to assert herself or challenge her husband's authority. Moreover, the age gap contributed to deep emotional asymmetry. A man in his 30s or 40s likely had lived through formative experiences, work, military service, legal disputes, or community involvement, while his teenage bride was just beginning to form her adult identity. The couple often shared little in terms of life experience, cultural perspective, or personal development. Communication was shaped by hierarchy, not mutual understanding. The age difference also impacted sexual relations. For many young brides, the physical and emotional consequences of sexual expectations within marriage were profound. The husband, being older and physically mature, held complete control over the timing and nature of consummation. The wife's consent, while technically required under canon law, was rarely considered a serious barrier. Once married, sexual access was assumed, and refusal was viewed as a form of disobedience. For a young wife still physically developing, this expectation could be painful, frightening, and disempowering. Children born from these unions further entrenched the imbalance. While motherhood could increase a woman's standing within the household, it also deepened her dependence on her husband. She was responsible for the care and survival of her children, but lacked the authority to make decisions about their future. The husband's decisions governed education, inheritance, and even marriage arrangements for the next generation. Over time, some women did grow into their roles, gaining experience, confidence, and sometimes influence within the home or community. But even then, the foundational imbalance remained. The marriage had been shaped from its inception by a system that positioned one partner as dominant and the other as dependent, based not only on gender, but on age. In this way, the age gap in medieval marriages was not incidental, it was intentional. It reinforced broader structures of authority, control, and hierarchy that defined medieval life. And for many young brides, it meant entering a household as a wife and servant, rather than as an equal partner. The power imbalance created by significant age gaps in medieval marriages did not disappear with time. In many cases, it became further entrenched. The assumption that a young wife would eventually grow into her role, maturing, adapting, or gaining influence, was a reflection of the social order, not the actual experience of most women. The age difference was not a temporary condition. It shaped the entire trajectory of the marriage and the life that followed. For a teenage girl married to a man a decade or more her senior, the first years of marriage were often defined by obedience and adaptation. Her husband, already established in his role as head of household, set the tone for the marriage. He had the final say in financial matters, discipline, work distribution, and child-rearing. Her lack of maturity and life experience, compounded by limited education and legal standing, meant that she was unlikely to challenge his authority, at least not in any formal or public sense. What followed was not an inevitable shift toward equality, but a continuation of dependency. A wife might become more competent in managing household affairs, overseeing servants, preparing food, or maintaining family accounts. But her growing capabilities did not necessarily translate into autonomy. Her identity remained closely tied to her husband's. She was the smith's wife, the miller's woman, or the lord's lady, defined primarily by his status and reputation. Even in noble households where women sometimes exercised soft power through patronage, household management, or influence over their sons, this influence was conditional. It required subtlety, deference, and adherence to prescribed roles. A wife who was seen as overstepping her authority or challenging her husband too directly could face social backlash, loss of status, or even repudiation. The age gap further complicated emotional dynamics within the marriage. In theory, shared life experience could bridge the difference in age, but in practice, emotional intimacy was often limited by hierarchy. A man who viewed his wife as a subordinate, a child when they married, and a dependent thereafter, was unlikely to treat her as an equal companion. The idea of romantic partnership, as we understand it today, had little place in the medieval household. Marriage was primarily functional. Compounding this unevenness was the issue of fertility and childbirth. From the moment of marriage, a woman was expected to bear children. Her biological youth made her valuable in this role, but it also placed her in danger. Medieval medicine had limited understanding of maternal health, and childbirth remained one of the leading causes of death for women. A girl in her early teens could find herself enduring multiple pregnancies before reaching adulthood, with each one carrying significant risk. The husband, older and generally in better health, might continue to work, travel, or participate in community life while his wife remained at home, tied to childbearing and domestic labour. The physical strain of early and repeated childbirth often led to chronic health problems, including exhaustion, infection, and even long-term disability. These issues further limited a woman's ability to assert herself or participate more fully in public life. Over time, some women did gain a degree of authority, particularly if their husbands died, and they were left widowed with property or children to manage. In such cases, a widow might take over a workshop, run a farm, or negotiate legal matters on behalf of her family. However, even this independence was often temporary. Widows were encouraged, sometimes pressured, to remarry, especially if they were still of childbearing age. A new marriage would once again place them under the legal authority of a husband, and the cycle would begin anew. It is also worth noting that the age gap often widened emotional isolation. A woman married young might outlive her husband, but not before spending the majority of her adult life under his control. By the time she reached her own full maturity, she had already spent decades in a role defined by subservience. The social and legal frameworks of medieval Europe offered little room for reflection, reinvention, or personal growth outside of the marriage contract. This lifetime of unevenness, rooted in age but reinforced by law, religion, and culture, meant that many women never truly caught up. Their roles were assigned early and rarely shifted. Their voices, if heard at all, were filtered through the authority of their husbands, fathers, or sons. The age gap did not just affect the beginning of the marriage, it defined the whole of it. For many medieval women, the only reprieve from a lifetime of marital dependency came through widowhood. But even this transition, while occasionally offering a degree of autonomy, often arrived abruptly and brought new forms of vulnerability. Given the typical age disparity between husbands and wives, widowhood was a frequent outcome, especially for women who married young. Their husbands, being significantly older, were more likely to die first. The result was a high number of young widows, many of whom found themselves responsible for households, children, and property, often without meaningful legal protection or financial security. The medieval period was marked by high mortality rates. War, disease, accident, and poor medical care shortened the average lifespan for both men and women, but the risks were distributed unequally. Men faced dangers on the battlefield and in physical labour, but women faced repeated risks through childbirth and domestic strain. Despite these overlapping threats, the age gap between spouses meant that many wives were left widowed while still in their 20s or 30s. In some cases, widowhood offered a woman more autonomy than she had ever known during marriage. A widow was legally no longer under her husband's authority, and in certain regions could own and manage property, act as a head of household, and conduct business in her own name. In cities and towns, widows might take over their deceased husband's trade, continue running a family shop, or manage rental properties and contracts. Some became respected figures in their communities, particularly if they had financial means or children who could assist with labour. However, such cases were exceptions. For most widows, particularly among the peasantry, widowhood did not bring independence. It brought instability. Without a husband, a woman often lost her primary source of income and legal standing. If she had no sons of legal age to inherit property or assume responsibility for the household, she might be forced to return to her natal family, enter domestic service, or remarry quickly out of necessity rather than choice. Property laws varied across medieval Europe, but in many areas, a widow's rights to her husband's land or goods were limited. She might be entitled to a portion of the estate, commonly referred to as a dower, but this often excluded actual ownership of land. The estate would pass to the eldest son or closest male heir, and the widow would be expected to vacate the property or continue living there only under their protection. If no children existed, she might face disputes with in-laws or other claimants, particularly if the marriage had involved multiple property transfers or unsettled debts. Widows with no dowry or family support were especially vulnerable. Some entered religious life, joining convents or becoming lay sisters, not always out of spiritual conviction, but because it was one of the few respectable options available to single women. Others became dependent on charity, local parish support, or informal networks of female labour, taking in laundry, spinning, or midwifery work to survive. In noble families, widows could wield more influence, especially if they held titles or oversaw the inheritance of minor children. A dowager lady might act as guardian, oversee estates, and negotiate future marriages for her children. However, her authority was usually limited to the interim period before her son or next male heir came of age. Once that occurred, her influence declined unless special arrangements had been made in her favour. Pressure to remarry was also common. Young widows of childbearing age were viewed as a resource to be reallocated. Families, church officials, or community leaders might actively encourage or even arrange second marriages. These unions were often just as transactional as the first, and again, the widow's personal wishes were secondary to the social or economic benefits of the match. Even where remarriage was not forced, the stigma of being alone could weigh heavily. Unmarried women, regardless of age, were often viewed with suspicion, particularly if they managed money, land, or labour independently. Accusations of impropriety or even witchcraft could follow women who lived outside male supervision, especially in periods of social tension or economic stress. Thus, while widowhood could in rare cases offer a woman freedom from the constraints of a lopsided marriage, it more often marked the beginning of a different kind of precariousness. A woman who had spent her life under the authority of her husband now faced the challenge of survival in a system that had never expected her to stand alone. The age gap that had shaped her marriage now shaped its aftermath, leaving many women widowed young, ill-prepared, and at the mercy of a legal and social system that still did not fully recognise them as independent agents. If widowhood offered any break from the lifelong burdens of medieval marriage, it was only because the expectations placed on married women were so heavy to begin with. From the moment a woman entered into matrimony, often while still in her teens, she was assigned a role shaped by cultural norms, religious doctrine, and economic necessity. She was to obey her husband, bear children, and endure whatever that life brought her, with little recourse and even less sympathy if she faltered. These were not optional responsibilities. They were the basic terms of participation in married life. Obedience to one's husband was viewed not only as a social rule, but as a religious duty. According to church teachings, the household was a microcosm of divine order. God ruled heaven, the king ruled the land, the husband ruled the home. To challenge that structure was to disrupt the natural and spiritual order. Sermons, religious texts, and even moral plays emphasized the virtue of the obedient wife. Women were instructed to be silent, industrious, faithful, and submissive, qualities that reinforced the husband's authority and minimized conflict. The expectation of obedience had legal teeth. In many parts of Europe, the law granted husbands the right to discipline their wives physically and to control their movements, social interactions, and labour. A disobedient wife could be reprimanded in private, humiliated in public, or in some cases, sent back to her family in disgrace, though divorce itself remained largely inaccessible. A woman who challenged her husband's decisions, especially in public or in front of others, risked being labelled troublesome, unfeminine, or immoral. But obedience was only part of the job. The other, more physically taxing expectation was childbearing. A woman's value in marriage was closely tied to her fertility. Bearing children, especially sons, was seen as her primary contribution to the household and to society at large. The pressure to produce heirs was constant, particularly in noble families where lineage and inheritance depended on male succession. But even among peasants and townspeople, children were considered economic assets, future workers, and a safeguard for old age. Having many children was idealised. The toll it took on a woman's body and health was largely ignored. There was no reliable birth control, and while some herbal knowledge existed in communities, contraception was discouraged by the church and sometimes legally prohibited. As a result, many women experienced pregnancy repeatedly over the course of their marriage. Childbirth itself was dangerous. Medical care was rudimentary at best, and the risks of infection, hemorrhage, or complications were ever present. For many women, the process of bearing children was not just a duty, it was a recurring brush with death. Recovery time between pregnancies was often minimal, and the demands of infant care fell entirely on the mother, feeding, cleaning, clothing, and watching over children, while also maintaining household duties, created an exhausting and unending cycle. If children died in infancy or early childhood, as many did, women were often expected to accept the loss silently and continue on. Public displays of grief were discouraged. Endurance, both physical and emotional, was expected as part of a woman's character. In addition to obedience and childbearing, the expectation of endurance extended to nearly every facet of married life. Whether her husband was kind or cruel, absent or overbearing, responsible or reckless, the wife was expected to remain loyal and to preserve the household's stability. Marital dissatisfaction was rarely acknowledged as legitimate grounds for complaint. Women who expressed unhappiness or questioned their roles were often dismissed or met with religious correction. The ideal wife endured without protest. This culture of endurance was reinforced by the church. Medieval religious literature praised women who suffered quietly and bore hardship with grace. Saints, martyrs, and biblical figures were held up as examples, especially those who submitted to male authority or survived domestic suffering. Endurance became a spiritual virtue, a sign of faith and devotion, rather than a symptom of a flawed system. There were no institutional support systems for women in unhappy or abusive marriages. Legal separation was possible in some regions under specific circumstances, such as adultery or abandonment, but actual divorce was forbidden by the church. Even if a woman had strong grounds for complaint, the process of seeking a formal separation was lengthy, costly, and socially dangerous. Most women had no choice but to stay and bear the conditions of their marriage, no matter how harsh. In this way, the role of a married woman in medieval Europe was clearly defined and brutally demanding. She was not expected to love her husband or find fulfillment in her marriage. She was expected to serve, submit, and survive. The expectation that a wife should endure all that marriage intended well beyond domestic labour and childbirth. It included her physical body. In medieval Europe, once a woman was married, her husband gained not only social and legal authority over her household role, but also assumed unrestricted sexual access. The concept of marital consent, as understood today, did not exist in either legal codes or church doctrine. A wife's refusal to engage in sexual relations was rarely recognised as valid, and the notion of sexual autonomy within marriage was fundamentally absent from medieval thought. The legal framework reflected this imbalance. Across much of medieval Europe, rape was considered a crime, but not if it occurred within marriage. A man could not legally be prosecuted for forcing himself upon his wife, because the marital union itself was seen as a permanent grant of sexual availability. The wife was expected to fulfill her marital debt, a term used by both secular authorities and ecclesiastical courts to describe a spouse's obligation to provide sexual access to the other partner, though in practice it overwhelmingly reinforced the husband's rights. Church doctrine reinforced this expectation. Canon law, while emphasizing that marriage was a sacrament, also explicitly taught that sex within marriage was not only permitted, but encouraged for the purpose of procreation. Marriage was considered the appropriate outlet for sexual desire and a key means of avoiding the sin of fornication. Once married, a woman was expected to make herself available to her husband, both to satisfy his desire and to ensure the continuation of the family line. Her willingness was not required, her duty was assumed. Refusal, even in cases of illness, pregnancy or fatigue, could be interpreted as defiance or even grounds for complaint in ecclesiastical court. While canon lawyers occasionally noted that both partners owed each other the debitum conjugale, the conjugal debt, enforcement again favoured men. A husband could accuse his wife of neglecting her duty, and while the reverse was technically possible, it was rare and carried little weight. Socially and spiritually, the wife was expected to yield. This framework had devastating consequences for women who were married young. Many were forced to engage in sexual activity before they were physically or emotionally ready, particularly when married to older men. The law offered no protection, and the community offered little sympathy. A woman might be known to suffer from frequent pregnancies, miscarriages, or injuries, but these were viewed as unfortunate consequences of her role, not as abuses of power. The physical toll was considerable. Repeated intercourse and childbirth, often starting in adolescence, led to chronic health issues including uterine prolapse, infection, and in extreme cases, death. These outcomes were accepted as part of a woman's life cycle, so common that they barely registered as extraordinary in contemporary records. In elite circles, there are accounts of noble women who died before the age of 20 after multiple pregnancies. Among peasants, such losses were less documented, but likely even more frequent due to the lack of access to midwives, rest, or proper nutrition. Emotionally, this lack of autonomy fostered deep and lasting trauma. Although medieval sources rarely record women's inner experiences, especially those of commoners, fragments survive in letters, court testimonies, and confessions. They hint at fear, shame, and resignation. A woman who was unhappy in her marriage had few options. Refusal could bring punishment, complaint could bring scandal, and legal redress was nearly impossible. Her body was no longer her own. It belonged to her husband, her family line, and the church's vision of a properly ordered society. There were exceptions. Some women, especially widows, found ways to assert greater control over their bodies and lives. A widow, no longer under the authority of a husband, could theoretically choose not to remarry and live independently, though this often came at economic and social cost. In rare cases, women of noble birth could negotiate marriage contracts that included specific terms regarding inheritance or separation. But these were exceptions available only to the powerful and well-connected. For the majority of women, marriage meant the end of bodily autonomy. From the wedding day forward, the husband's rights overruled personal comfort, health, or consent. Sexual obligation was folded into the broader expectations of obedience and endurance. A wife was expected to serve her husband, produce his heirs, and do so without resistance. In the eyes of medieval society, that was her role. And questioning it was not only unthinkable, it was, by definition, wrong. While a medieval wife was expected to submit physically and sexually to her husband, she was also tasked with the full management of the household, a responsibility that required constant labour, careful organisation, and near-constant vigilance. This work, while essential to the functioning of everyday life, was largely invisible in public records and unacknowledged in legal or religious texts. A woman's labour, no matter how extensive, was simply part of her role. It was expected, not praised. Required, not rewarded. In nearly every stratum of medieval society, the household was the economic heart of the family. For peasants, it was the centre of food production, textile creation, child-rearing, and animal care. For merchants and artisans, the home often doubled as a workplace, a site of manufacturing, accounting, and trade. Even in noble households, where servants and retainers performed much of the physical labour, the lady of the house was expected to oversee operations, ensure proper conduct, and manage resources. Regardless of class, the domestic domain was her domain. The range of tasks assigned to wives was staggering. They spun wool, wove cloth, cooked meals, baked bread, brewed ale, preserved food, fetched water, tended fires, cleaned linens, and raised children. In agricultural households, they also participated in planting, weeding, harvesting, and caring for animals. In urban settings, they helped run shops, kept accounts, and managed apprentices. Widows often continued these responsibilities while also assuming the legal duties of a male head of household. Yet, none of this work was seen as extraordinary. It was simply part of being a wife. What's more, this labour was unpaid and taken for granted. Unlike men, who received wages or social credit for their work, women's contributions were folded into the idea of marital obligation. A wife who managed a productive farm or workshop was rarely recognised as a worker in her own right. Instead, her labour was seen as an extension of her husband's status. Her efforts were his success, her skill his profit. Even her dowry, sometimes consisting of tools, livestock or textiles, was absorbed into his estate, further blurring the line between her resources and his control. Religious and moral teachings reinforced this invisibility. Medieval texts urged women to be diligent, humble, and industrious, but not proud or public about their accomplishments. The ideal wife worked tirelessly and quietly, without demanding recognition. If she succeeded in feeding and clothing her household, she had fulfilled her purpose. If she sought attention or acknowledgement, she risked being seen as vain or disruptive. Silence was a virtue. Praise was rare. The absence of recognition also extended to formal education and literacy. Few women, especially among the lower classes, were taught to read or write. This limited their ability to document their own experiences, manage complex transactions independently, or engage with the legal and economic systems that surrounded them. Even in wealthier families, education for girls focused on religious instruction and domestic skills, rather than broader intellectual or administrative training. The tools that might have helped women advocate for themselves or gain public credit for their labour were, in most cases, deliberately withheld. Despite these constraints, some women developed considerable skill in managing money, land, and labour. In cases where husbands were absent due to war, travel, or death, wives stepped in to maintain operations, pay rents, and supervise workers. Some became known in their communities for their competence, especially in towns where women participated more actively in trade. But even then, their contributions were often documented only in passing, if at all. Legal documents recorded property transfers in the names of men. Business contracts were signed by husbands. Wills frequently credited sons and male relatives, even when daughters or wives had done much of the actual labour. The lack of recognition had consequences beyond pride. Without formal acknowledgement of their work, women struggled to gain access to resources, make independent decisions, or claim credit in legal disputes. If a husband died without naming his wife in a will, her right to inherit, or even remain in her home, could be challenged. If she had contributed years of labour to a family business, there was often no documentation to support her claim to a share of the assets. Her work, though foundational, was largely unprotected. In short, the expectations placed on medieval wives demanded labour equal in scale to any other member of the household. But unlike the work of their husbands, sons, or even hired labourers, it was carried out without formal status, compensation, or legal recognition. It was invisible in court records, underrepresented in chronicles, and undervalued in cultural memory. A wife might labour from before dawn until after dark, feed a household of 10, run a small holding or shop, raise several children, and still be described in the historical record with a single word: obedient. If the unrecognised labour of a medieval wife underscored her invisibility in the public and legal spheres, then her ability or inability to produce a male heir became the one area where she was highly visible, and dangerously so. In a world where family lineage, inheritance, and household continuity rested on the shoulders of male offspring, the birth of sons was not just a cause for celebration, it was a requirement. A woman who failed to meet the expectation was often blamed, scrutinised, and in some cases replaced. In both noble and common households, sons represented security. Among the nobility, sons were needed to inherit titles, estates, and power. Daughters could be married off, but they did not carry on the family name or legacy. Among the peasantry and emerging merchant classes, sons were future labourers, essential to maintaining farms, running businesses, and caring for ageing parents. A wife who bore sons had fulfilled her core marital purpose. A wife who bore only daughters, or who remained childless, was seen as falling short of her duty. This pressure began immediately after marriage. Women were expected to conceive quickly, and successive pregnancies were common. If months passed without signs of pregnancy, the woman was often the first to be questioned. While medieval medical theories occasionally recognised male infertility, the dominant belief was that the woman's body was primarily responsible for conception. If no children arrived, or if daughters continued to be born in place of sons, the wife became the focus of concern and criticism. Among the elite, the consequences could be severe. In royal and aristocratic circles, a failure to produce sons could lead to annulment, accusations of witchcraft or immorality, or political manoeuvring to bring in a new, more suitable bride. There are recorded cases of noble women being set aside for their inability to bear sons, despite multiple pregnancies or clear evidence of their husband's advanced age or health issues. The pressure to secure a male heir outweighed nearly every other consideration. Even among commoners, a woman who failed to produce sons could lose status and stability. Her husband might take a mistress or seek remarriage if permitted. Her in-laws might treat her with contempt, blaming her for the uncertainty of the family's future. If her husband died without a male heir, her position in the household could become tenuous, particularly if land or property reverted to a male relative. Daughters rarely held inheritance rights on par with sons, and widows without male children often lacked long-term protection. The emotional toll of this expectation was compounded by the frequency of infant and child mortality. Even when sons were born, there was no guarantee they would survive to adulthood. Women might endure multiple pregnancies, childbirths, and losses, all while facing pressure to try again for a surviving heir. The physical and psychological strain was immense, yet culturally normalized. The loss of an infant son was a private sorrow, but the public concern was often less about grief and more about succession. Religious teachings offered little solace. While the Church emphasized that children were gifts from God and that all life was sacred, its doctrine also reinforced the idea that women should be fruitful and multiply. A barren womb or repeated failure to produce male children could be interpreted as divine punishment for sin or moral failure. Women might fast, pray, or seek blessings in hopes of altering their fate, but their worth remained tethered to their fertility and to the gender of their children. Medical remedies and folk practices further reflected this anxiety. Texts from the period include numerous recipes, prayers, and rituals aimed at ensuring conception or influencing the sex of a child, many of them directed solely at women. Midwives and herbalists, often the only sources of reproductive care, were expected to assist not just with safe delivery, but with the production of sons. If a birth resulted in a daughter or stillbirth, it was not unusual for the woman to bear the blame, even when the outcome was beyond anyone's control. In cases where sons were eventually born, previous disappointment was often erased. The birth of a healthy male child could redeem a woman's status in her husband's eyes and within the community. But this redemption was conditional and fragile. A wife who had experienced years of pressure or mistreatment due to her failure to produce sons might never fully regain her social standing, particularly if the marriage had been strained or her husband had begun looking elsewhere. Thus, the expectation of male heirs added yet another layer of risk and judgment to a woman's role in medieval marriage. Her ability to produce sons was treated not as a natural hope or private joy, but as a public obligation. Any failure to meet it could have lasting, life-altering consequences. As if the pressure to bear sons and maintain a household weren't enough, medieval women also had to contend with an openly unequal moral code regarding fidelity. While wives were expected to remain strictly faithful to their husbands under both religious and secular law, men were granted far more leniency, socially, legally, and culturally. In short, if a man strayed from his marital vows, it was tolerated, even expected in some circles. If a woman did the same, the consequences could be catastrophic. Medieval societies were patriarchal at every level. Authority in marriage was deeply imbalanced, and so too were the expectations of sexual behaviour. A wife's fidelity was crucial because it ensured the legitimacy of heirs, particularly sons. Paternity fraud, though the term did not exist at the time, was a serious concern among landowning and noble families. Any doubt about a child's lineage could result in inheritance disputes and the collapse of carefully arranged alliances. As such, women's sexuality was tightly controlled. In contrast, men's sexual behaviour was judged far more leniently. A husband who visited brothels, kept a mistress, or even fathered illegitimate children outside of marriage was rarely punished, especially if he was wealthy or held status. For noblemen, extramarital relationships were often common knowledge, and in some cases the children of such unions were acknowledged, given minor positions, or even integrated into household operations, though they typically did not inherit unless legitimized. The Church technically condemned adultery by both sexes, and canon law held that marriage was a mutual contract of fidelity. But in practice, enforcement was far more aggressive against women. A wife suspected of infidelity could face social ostracism, legal repercussions, or violent retribution from her husband or his family. In extreme cases, she could be divorced, imprisoned, forced into a convent, or even killed. Her children might be declared illegitimate and her reputation irreparably ruined. Among the peasantry, where formal legal processes were less common, community enforcement of moral codes was swift and harsh. Gossip, public shaming, and exclusion were all tools used to regulate women's behaviour. A woman seen spending too much time with a man who was not her husband could become the subject of suspicion. If she became pregnant under uncertain circumstances, she risked being cast out or losing any claim to support from the father or local authorities. Men, meanwhile, often escaped even social censure. A husband known to be unfaithful might be criticised in private, but rarely faced formal punishment unless he brought scandal to a noble house or challenged the church's authority too publicly. Many male transgressions were simply ignored, framed as natural expressions of masculine desire. In towns, prostitution was not only tolerated, but regulated by civic authorities, seen as a necessary outlet to prevent the moral decay of society. The law reinforced this imbalance. While adultery was theoretically a crime, prosecution depended heavily on gender and status. Husbands had the legal right in some regions to punish adulterous wives, sometimes with violence or confinement, while wives had no comparable legal recourse against unfaithful husbands. If a wife attempted to seek an annulment or separation due to her husband's infidelity, she faced an uphill battle in ecclesiastical courts, which often favoured marital stability over individual justice. Even within marriage, the lines of consent and coercion were blurry. A woman's obligation to submit sexually to her husband meant that protest, even in the face of abuse or neglect, was rarely viewed as legitimate. If a man strayed outside the marriage, his wife was still expected to remain loyal, manage the home, and avoid public complaint. To speak out too loudly was to risk being labelled disobedient or ungrateful. This imbalance extended into widowhood as well. While widowers were often encouraged to remarry and produce more heirs, widows were scrutinised more harshly for any perceived impropriety. A young widow who chose not to remarry or who engaged in a relationship outside of formal union could face reputational ruin. Her sexuality, still seen as a threat to social order, was considered something to be policed long after her husband's death. In sum, the double standard was clear. A medieval man could break his marriage vows without much consequence. A woman who did the same might lose everything: her home, her children, her standing, and even her life. The ideals of honour, purity, and family reputation rested squarely on the shoulders of women, while men moved far more freely within and beyond the institution of marriage. When the social double standard allowed men to stray while their wives were bound by law and expectation to remain faithful, one consequence was inevitable: illegitimate children. Known contemporarily as bastards, these children were born outside the bonds of legal marriage, and their place in medieval society was often precarious. While their existence was commonplace, especially among noble families, their status was riddled with limitations, inconsistencies, and harsh societal judgment. In most parts of medieval Europe, legitimacy had significant legal implications, particularly when it came to inheritance. A legitimate son could inherit his father's land, titles, or business. An illegitimate son, even if publicly acknowledged, had no automatic right to any of it. Legitimacy was tied not to parentage, but to the circumstances of birth, specifically whether the parents were married at the time. As such, the law treated bastards as legally distinct, regardless of their relationship to their fathers. This legal barrier didn't always reflect the private realities of family life. Noblemen and wealthy merchants often had long-standing extramarital relationships with mistresses or servants, and children born of those unions might be raised within the household or supported financially. It was not uncommon for powerful men to provide their illegitimate offspring with education, training, or marriage arrangements. However, the social and legal status of these children remained limited. They might benefit from proximity to power, but they could not inherit it. In some cases, particularly among royalty and the higher nobility, kings and lords openly acknowledged their bastards and even granted them titles or lands. These exceptions were made through special charters or papal dispensations. William the Conqueror himself was famously born out of wedlock, and yet his military strength and political manoeuvring secured his rise to kingship. But these were the rare few. For most illegitimate children, particularly among the lower ranks, life was far more uncertain. The Church maintained a firm stance on legitimacy. Canon law viewed marriage as a sacrament, and children born outside of it were considered spiritually and socially inferior. Although the church emphasized that every soul had value, illegitimate children were often barred from clerical positions, and their social prospects were limited by the stigma attached to their birth. A bastard son might be accepted into society as a servant, squire, or even merchant, but he would face more obstacles than his legitimate peers. A bastard daughter, doubly disadvantaged by gender and status, might have few options beyond marriage to a lower-class man or a life in domestic labour. The mother of an illegitimate child bore even greater consequences. While men could return to their lives with little more than a whisper of scandal, women were marked by their pregnancies. Unwed motherhood was seen as a sign of moral failure. A woman who gave birth out of wedlock might be fined, shunned, or forced to confess her sins publicly. In some towns, local authorities required women to name the father or face punishment themselves. If she refused or was unable to name him, perhaps because the father was a powerful man, she shouldered the burden alone. In rural communities, unwed mothers were often driven to the margins of society. Some joined religious orders or lived in service to other households as a means of survival. Others might give their children up to be raised by relatives, or, in dire cases, leave them at a church or abbey in hopes of a better life. The shame attached to illegitimacy extended through generations. Children born from such unions were often reminded, explicitly or implicitly, that their place in the world was conditional. Despite these obstacles, illegitimate children could and did make lives for themselves. Some entered the military, the clergy through loopholes or leniency, or became tradesmen. In merchant cities where economic growth allowed for more social mobility, bastards occasionally rose in status through personal achievement. But the path was steep, and the rules were stacked against them. For married women, however, the presence of bastards in their household, whether acknowledged or not, was another reminder of the inequality embedded in the institution of marriage. A wife might be expected to tolerate her husband's affairs, endure his illegitimate children, and maintain a dignified silence. Her own fidelity was non-negotiable. His infidelity, by contrast, was a social inconvenience at worst, a political asset at best. Thus, bastards were both symptoms and symbols of a broader system that allowed men freedom and denied women recourse. Their lives, complicated and constrained, reveal yet another facet of how medieval marriage privileged power and appearance over fairness or affection. If a married man's affair resulted in an illegitimate child, the consequences were often personal or political, but rarely legal. For women, however, accusations of adultery carried not only social stigma, but formal punishment. Across medieval Europe, the legal and ecclesiastical systems were deeply unequal when it came to sexual morality within marriage. While men strayed with impunity, wives were subjected to scrutiny, humiliation, and at times institutional sanction. The heart of the imbalance lay in the intersection of paternity, property, and patriarchy. A wife's fidelity was essential to the assurance of legitimate heirs, particularly among landholding classes. A husband needed to be certain that his children were truly his, so that land, wealth, and titles passed to the correct bloodline. As such, a wife's body was considered part of her husband's estate, and any threat to its exclusivity was treated as a direct threat to lineage, inheritance, and honour. Legal codes reflected this anxiety. In many regions, secular law criminalised adultery, sometimes broadly but more often specifically when committed by a married woman. Punishments ranged from fines and public shaming to corporal punishment, confinement, or annulment. In some city statutes, women accused of adultery could be paraded through the streets in humiliating garments, have their heads shaved, or be locked away in a public cage or tower. The goal was not only to correct behaviour but to reinforce social order by making an example of the offender. By contrast, husbands caught in extramarital relationships were rarely punished unless their actions caused disruption to noble alliances or violated church authority. Adultery by a man was considered a private failing. Adultery by a woman was a public threat. Ecclesiastical courts, those operated by the church, were similarly harsh toward women. Though canon law theoretically held men and women to the same moral standards, enforcement was not equal. A woman suspected of adultery could be summoned to confess before a bishop, compelled to undergo penance or excommunicated. Confessions were sometimes extracted under duress or social pressure, and even unproven accusations could result in reputational ruin. The evidentiary standards were also skewed. If a man accused his wife of infidelity, his testimony often carried weight on its own. If a woman accused her husband, she needed witnesses or physical proof, rarely available in private matters. The presumption of guilt fell more readily on women. Gossip, gestures, or even proximity to another man could lead to suspicion, especially in tightly knit rural communities where everyone watched everyone else. The consequences of being labelled an adulteress extended beyond legal punishment. A woman cast out by her husband, whether or not she had actually committed adultery, could lose her home, her children, and her livelihood. In some regions, the law permitted a husband to reclaim his wife's dowry or deny her further support. If she was not taken back by her natal family, she might be left destitute. For women of higher status, the disgrace could mean political exile or forced retreat to a convent. Cultural narratives reinforced this double standard. Literature, sermons, and moral treatises often depicted adulterous women as destructive, deceptive, or demonic. The trope of the unfaithful wife, whether Delilah, Jezebel, or a fictional noblewoman, was used to warn other women of the dangers of disobedience. Meanwhile, male infidelity was often excused or ignored. A straying husband might be portrayed as foolish or weak, but rarely as wicked. This disparity also created room for abuse. A husband who wished to be rid of his wife might accuse her of adultery to justify separation or punishment. Given the weight of male testimony and the difficulty of disproving an accusation, the charge became a weapon. Some women were forced to confess under threat of violence or public ruin. Others were never formally accused, but lived under the suspicion that ruined their standing nonetheless. In urban centres where moral regulation was more structured, adultery could become a matter of public record. Town councils, guilds, or ecclesiastical institutions sometimes kept rolls of known offenders, lists that included women by name, but rarely men. These records followed women throughout their lives, affecting remarriage prospects, business dealings, and even their children's reputations. Thus, the legal and cultural system surrounding adultery in the medieval period was not merely unequal, it was aggressively punitive toward women. Wives who transgressed were made examples of, stripped of dignity and legal protections and pushed to the margins. Husbands, by contrast, moved through society with their infidelities largely forgiven or forgotten. The expectation of absolute fidelity, when paired with the possibility of false accusations, turned marriage into a precarious institution for many women. The very thing meant to offer social protection and legitimacy could become, at a moment's notice, a source of danger and disgrace. If a woman in medieval Europe was expected to be faithful, obedient, fertile, and forgiving, it was because the very framework of marriage was not built on mutual affection, but on institutional control. And nowhere was that more evident than in how forgiveness, and the lack of it, played out between spouses. A woman could be shamed publicly for perceived infidelity, abandoned for failing to produce sons, or beaten into obedience. But if her husband strayed, mistreated her, or dishonoured his vows, forgiveness wasn't hers to give or withhold. That power belonged elsewhere, most often to the church. Marriage was considered a sacrament, and as such was under the jurisdiction of ecclesiastical courts. These church-run systems handled everything from betrothals and consummation disputes to annulments and accusations of adultery. But their interpretation of justice leaned heavily in favour of preserving the institution of marriage itself, not necessarily the well-being of the individuals inside it. A wife's grievances, no matter how justified, were routinely minimised if they threatened the sanctity of the union. When a husband committed adultery, abused his wife, or failed to provide for her, a woman might appeal to church authorities. But the outcome of that appeal was deeply uncertain. The church emphasised reconciliation, not separation. A priest might encourage the woman to pray for her husband, to bear his behaviour with patience, and to remain within the marriage for the sake of her soul or her children's souls. In many cases, even priests acknowledged privately that some marriages were harsh, but publicly they stood firm. A bad marriage was better than no marriage. Forgiveness, when framed in sermons or confessionals, was depicted as a moral obligation, especially for women. Christian doctrine taught that suffering in silence was virtuous, and that wives had a spiritual duty to model grace and humility. This expectation was not evenly applied. A man who forgave a straying wife might be mocked. A woman who failed to forgive a cruel or unfaithful husband was judged as bitter or sinful. Moreover, women lacked the institutional support to act on their decisions. If a wife chose not to forgive, she had few practical options. Divorce in the modern sense did not exist. Legal separation was rare, and annulment, essentially a retroactive declaration that a valid marriage never existed, was only granted under very specific and often politically influenced circumstances. Abuse, cruelty, or adultery were not considered sufficient grounds on their own. Instead, petitioners had to prove pre-existing impediments to marriage, such as consanguinity, being too closely related, impotence, or forced consent. And even then, the process was lengthy, expensive, and humiliating. In the rare event that a woman did receive a legal separation, her life did not necessarily improve. She might be barred from remarriage, forced to return to her natal family, or left destitute. Her social standing would suffer, and so would her children's. The church had absolved her of her husband, but not of the consequences. Thus, most women stayed, not because they had truly forgiven their husbands, but because forgiveness was the only socially and spiritually sanctioned path forward. The church's tendency to side with husbands was not always explicit, but it was pervasive. Male authority was assumed to be ordained by God. Wives were expected to submit. If a priest had to mediate a marital dispute, he was more likely to emphasize the wife's duty than hold the husband accountable. Even when husbands were clearly in the wrong, their repentance, if offered, was often enough to restore their standing. Wives were told to accept this and move on, lest they be seen as uncharitable or rebellious. This dynamic created an atmosphere in which forgiveness became performative. A woman might go through the motions because it was expected. She might welcome a penitent husband back into her bed, not out of trust, but because defiance could mean ruin. Meanwhile, the husband's return to good graces depended not on his wife's feelings, but on the church's judgment. Her personal experience, her trauma, anger, or betrayal was secondary. Over time, this expectation of unconditional forgiveness reinforced a broader truth about medieval marriage. It was not an equal partnership. It was a hierarchy sanctioned by religion, law, and custom. And within that hierarchy, women were granted little room to refuse, to resist, or even to withhold forgiveness. Their compliance was not a gift freely given. It was demanded, required, and ultimately judged by authorities far outside the walls of their homes. By the standards of modern relationships, medieval marriage often seems cold, transactional, and even coercive. But in a time when most women had no legal status apart from their husbands or fathers, marriage wasn't just a cultural expectation, it was, quite literally, a survival strategy. In many cases, a husband's role wasn't to be a romantic partner, but to serve as a provider, protector, and social shield. Passion was optional, provision was not. For most medieval women, options outside marriage were scarce. Single women, especially past childbearing age, were viewed with suspicion or pity. Widows could sometimes maintain property or remarry, but young unmarried women had few prospects. Unless they entered a convent, their economic security and social standing depended on attaching themselves to a male head of household. First their fathers, then their husbands. In this context, marriage was not about companionship. It was about protection from destitution. This was especially true for women of the lower classes. A peasant woman without a husband had no claim to land and no formal rights to the fruits of her labour. She might work in exchange for food or shelter, but wages, if offered, were minimal. Marrying a man with a small plot of land or a place in a lord's workforce gave her access to the resources necessary for basic survival. She could keep animals, raise children, and contribute to the household economy. Without that marital link, she was legally and economically vulnerable. In towns and cities, this reality was only slightly different. A woman born into a merchant or artisan family might have the chance to learn a trade, but even then, her work was typically conducted under the name of her father or husband. A single woman might assist in a family shop or help manage a stall, but it was her male relatives who dealt with legal contracts, owned property, and spoke in guild meetings. If she married, she transferred that dependency to her husband. If not, she remained in legal limbo. Among the nobility, marriage was a safeguard of political and financial interests. Daughters were married off to strengthen alliances, consolidate land, and produce heirs. Their personal wishes were rarely considered. Even in the best-case scenario, where a noblewoman was treated kindly by her husband, her well-being remained tethered to his decisions. If he fell out of favour with the crown, died in battle, or squandered his fortune, she bore the consequences. A good match meant safety. A poor one meant exposure to the unpredictable currents of court and war. The necessity of protection often meant tolerating much more than mere indifference. Abuse, infidelity, neglect, these were endured not because women didn't notice or didn't care, but because refusing to tolerate them could cost them everything. A woman who left her husband, even for just cause, might find herself homeless, without children, or at the mercy of her natal family, assuming they would take her back. In many cases, they would not. Dowries had already been paid, reputations were at stake, and the church disapproved of separation except under the rarest conditions. Even for women in physically secure homes, protection meant more than shelter. It meant access to food. It meant having clothes that fit and could be mended. It meant being seen as part of a legitimate household and not as a burden or threat. Starvation was a real risk for the unmarried poor, especially during bad harvests or harsh winters. Being a wife, especially one with children, meant inclusion in food distribution and seasonal labour networks. The bread on the table might not have come with affection, but it came with stability. None of this meant that marriages were devoid of affection entirely. Some couples developed respect, companionship, or even love over time. But these were happy accidents, not expectations. The system wasn't designed to foster intimacy. It was designed to secure alliances, transfer property, and ensure survival in a fragile world. Marriage was above all a practical necessity. Women learned to navigate these realities in many ways. Some wielded quiet influence within their households. Others leaned on female networks for support, but the foundation remained unchanged. A husband, for better or worse, was often a woman's best chance at surviving adulthood with dignity, food, and a roof overhead. If a medieval woman wanted food, shelter, and basic protection, she needed a husband. There were exceptions, nuns, midwives, some widows, but for the overwhelming majority of women, marriage was not simply an expected life event. It was the only route to material survival. Poverty wasn't just a risk of staying single, it was the almost guaranteed outcome. The social structure of the Middle Ages left women dependent on male guardianship for legal identity and economic access. A daughter relied on her father's household. A wife relied on her husband's. A widow might rely on grown sons or return to her natal family if they allowed it. An unmarried woman who lacked these protections often became a servant, beggar, or outcast. The system was not designed with female independence in mind. For women of the peasantry, the daily necessities, firewood, bread, milk, wool, were tied to access to land or labour, and both were usually controlled by men. A woman could assist in the fields, gather kindling, tend animals, and prepare food, but only as a member of a recognised household. She had no claim to land in her own name. Nor could she easily participate in trade or secure paid employment that would allow her to live alone. Even if she worked, the wages were so low that living independently was unrealistic. A male labourer might earn just enough to scrape by on his own. A female worker, if paid at all, often earned half as much, or less. In towns and cities, some unmarried women found work as seamstresses, laundresses, or domestic servants, but their lives were precarious. The work was often seasonal, physically demanding, and poorly paid. Women without husbands might sleep in shared rooms, attics, or rented corners of other households. They were at risk of exploitation, theft, and assault, especially if they were young or lacked family nearby. The stigma of being unattached made it harder to secure stable positions or legal protection. People assumed that an unmarried woman must be promiscuous, desperate, or mentally unwell. These assumptions affected not only her treatment, but her chances of survival. Marriage, by contrast, offered legitimacy. A wife might still be poor, but she was part of the social fabric. She could appear in public without attracting suspicion. She had access to food through her husband's earnings or labour. She could raise children without being branded immoral. She might still work, especially during harvests or in family workshops, but her role was defined and accepted. She belonged somewhere. This harsh divide was even more pronounced during times of famine, war, or plague. When communities faced scarcity, unmarried women were among the first to suffer. Without a husband or father to vouch for them, they might be denied aid, forced into labour, or pushed out of the village entirely. In periods of social upheaval, the fragile place that single women occupied became even more unstable. Some turned to begging or prostitution. Others tried to attach themselves to households as wet nurses, midwives, or live-in maids. A few entered the church, though even this required dowries or patronage. The church itself was clear about the ideal female path: virgin, then wife, then widow. Unmarried adult women who didn't fit those categories lived in the grey zone. While the church promoted chastity, it also viewed unmarried women as dangerous or suspicious unless they had taken formal vows. Marriage, therefore, was the acceptable alternative to spiritual vocation. If a woman could not become a nun, and most could not, she was expected to become a wife. For many families, marriage arrangements were not romantic, but strategic. A daughter was not just married off to someone kind or suitable, she was placed with someone who could feed her. Fathers knew this. Mothers did too. The choice was stark: marry her off to a man with a small plot and some goats, or risk her ending up homeless. Even abusive or unstable marriages were sometimes tolerated because they still offered more stability than a woman could find on her own. This dependency wasn't just emotional or cultural, it was economic. The entire medieval world was built on the assumption that women belonged in households run by men. It was how labour was divided, how wealth was distributed, and how morality was judged. There was no room, in most places, for a woman who simply wanted to live alone, work for herself, or choose not to marry. Poverty, or even starvation, was the likely outcome of that decision, and so most women married. Not for love, not for joy, but because, quite simply, there wasn't another option. If medieval women married because there were no real alternatives, they often stayed married because they had no way out. Even when a marriage was abusive, loveless, or harmful, the barriers to separation were daunting. Divorce in the modern sense, where a legal union is officially dissolved and both parties are free to remarry, did not exist for most people in medieval Europe. Instead, couples were bound by a system of law and faith that defined marriage as lifelong and virtually unbreakable. The dominant legal force behind marriage in medieval Europe was the church. By the 12th century, marriage had been declared a sacrament, one of the holy rites administered by the church, just like baptism or communion. This meant that marriage was considered not merely a social or legal agreement, but a sacred covenant before God. Once entered, it was meant to be indissoluble. The phrase, "until death do us part," was not symbolic, it was the rule. For most women, that rule was a life sentence. The church did allow for something called separation from bed and board, or separatio a mensa et thoro. This permitted a couple to live apart in extreme cases, such as when one spouse was violent or abusive, but it did not dissolve the marriage. Neither party was allowed to remarry, and any future relationships would be considered adulterous. Even this limited form of separation required significant resources to pursue and was rarely granted. Most women, particularly those of the lower classes, lacked the money, legal knowledge, or social leverage to appeal to a church court. Annulment was another option, but it was extremely difficult to obtain. An annulment was not a divorce, it was a declaration that the marriage had never been valid in the first place. The grounds for annulment were narrow and specific. One or both parties were too closely related, one party was underage or already married, the marriage had not been consummated, or consent had been coerced. Proving these claims was difficult, especially if the marriage had already produced children. Even when successful, annulments were typically reserved for nobles or elites with political motivations and church connections. For the average woman in a miserable marriage, there was no viable escape. The law offered no mechanism for divorce, and the church discouraged even informal separations. Priests urged forgiveness, endurance, and prayer, not independence or justice. Suffering within marriage was viewed as a spiritual trial, particularly for women. Bearing an unkind or abusive husband was, in some sermons, likened to sharing in Christ's suffering. Civil law offered no alternative. In most regions, the state deferred to the church in matters of marriage and morality. Courts were unlikely to intervene unless property or inheritance disputes arose. A woman who fled her husband, even for good reason, could be declared a runaway and forced to return. If she sought shelter with relatives or in a convent, she often had to prove that she had not committed adultery or abandoned her marital duties. This system left women with impossible choices: stay in a dangerous or degrading situation or risk social ruin. Those who did attempt to leave faced harsh consequences. They could lose custody of their children, their dowry, and their status. In many towns and villages, a separated or abandoned woman was treated as suspect, regardless of the circumstances. Her presence was seen as disruptive. Her story, however true, was often doubted. It's worth noting that these rules weren't always enforced uniformly. In some places, local customs allowed for informal separations, especially if the community sympathised with the wife. But these were exceptions, not norms. And even when a woman was permitted to live apart from her husband, she rarely regained full autonomy. She remained married in the eyes of the church and could not legally remarry or claim property as an independent person. Men, too, were bound by these laws, but they had more flexibility. They could engage in extramarital relationships with fewer consequences. They could move on, socially and sexually, while their wives remained trapped by legal, financial and religious constraints. The system favoured continuity over fairness, structure over justice. In the medieval world, marriage was permanent by design. The law did not aim to protect individuals from harm. It aimed to protect the institution of marriage itself. And that meant that for countless women, there was no exit. Once married, their lives were largely defined by that decision, with no legal or spiritual path toward a different future. When a husband died in medieval Europe, his widow did not always grieve in private for long. While some widows did choose to remain single, particularly those who inherited property or had grown children, most remarried quickly. The decision was rarely about romance or longing. It was a calculation. A widow's position in society was deeply precarious, and remarriage was often the fastest, most reliable way to regain stability. For peasant women, the death of a husband could mean instant economic crisis. A family's land, tools, livestock, and even shelter were usually held in the husband's name. Upon his death, unless specific provisions were made, that property passed to sons, brothers, or the landlord, not the widow. If she had young children, she might be allowed to remain in the household temporarily, but only as a caretaker of her husband's heirs. Without a legal claim to land or resources, her status could change overnight from wife to dependent. In these cases, remarriage was about survival. A second marriage restored her role within a household and ensured access to food, firewood, and shelter. If she had children from her first marriage, a new husband might also provide protection and continuity for them, though not always willingly. Inheritance complications often arose when children from a previous marriage competed with children from a new union, but the risk of instability didn't outweigh the immediate need for security. Among the merchant and artisan classes, widows had a slightly broader range of options. In some cities, a widow could legally take over her husband's workshop or continue trading in his name. Guilds occasionally recognised widows as business owners, especially if no sons were old enough to inherit. However, these allowances were often temporary. Unless the widow remarried or passed the business to a male relative, she might eventually lose her right to operate. For many, remarriage was not just about securing food, it was about preserving their social and economic status. Among the nobility, remarriage was even more strategic. Widows of knights, barons, or wealthy landowners were often seen as valuable marriage prospects, particularly if they brought a dowry, land rights, or political alliances to the table. Families negotiated new marriages for widows with the same urgency they applied to virginal daughters. A noble woman of childbearing age might be remarried within months, particularly if her late husband's estate needed new management or if a nearby lord sought stronger ties to her family. In these cases, the widow's consent was not always a deciding factor. Just as many women were married off the first time without a say, they might find themselves bartered again for political or financial advantage. Widows with powerful families sometimes negotiated better terms, such as retaining control over their late husband's lands or ensuring rights for their children, but not all had that leverage. Remarriage was a transaction, not a reward for faithful mourning. The Church, for its part, did not forbid remarriage, but it encouraged widows to remain chaste and devoted to prayer. The ideal Christian widow was pious and withdrawn from worldly concerns, perhaps even entering a convent or living under the guidance of a religious house. In reality, most widows could not afford to take that path. Their lives were too entangled with material needs, and few had the independent means to withdraw from public life. There were exceptions. Wealthy or well-connected widows sometimes chose to remain unmarried, especially if they had already fulfilled their childbearing duties and could live on inherited income. These women occasionally gained a level of autonomy rare for the time. They could manage estates, arrange marriages for their children, and participate in patronage or local governance. But they were the minority. For most women, especially those without significant inheritance, the death of a husband was not a moment of freedom. It was a crisis to be resolved. Remarriage then was not a romantic renewal, but a practical necessity. A widow weighed her options quickly and did what was needed to stay afloat. This often meant accepting a match that offered protection, resources, and social acceptance, even if it came with new responsibilities, new conflicts, or a stranger in her bed. The truth was simple. The institution of marriage did not loosen its grip with death. It merely reset the clock. If marriage in the medieval world was supposed to offer women protection and structure, the reality was often far harsher. While the institution promised shelter, it also permitted, and in some cases explicitly justified, control through violence. A husband who beat his wife was not necessarily considered cruel or criminal. He was often viewed as fulfilling a duty, correcting disobedience, maintaining order, or reasserting authority. In short, domestic abuse was not just tolerated, it was institutionalized. Medieval legal codes across Europe, both secular and ecclesiastical, operated on the presumption that husbands were heads of households and held the right to discipline their wives. This right of correction was a social norm. While laws occasionally placed limits on the severity of violence, the enforcement of those limits was inconsistent, and the bar for what counted as excessive was high. A man might be reprimanded or fined if he maimed or killed his wife, but short of that, little was done. In many cases, beating one's wife was not seen as a crime at all. In fact, it was often regarded as a sign that a man was managing his household properly. Court records and church sermons suggest that some communities even ridiculed men who appeared too lenient with their wives. If a woman was outspoken or disobedient, it was assumed that her husband had failed in his role as a disciplinarian. His honour was tied not only to his wife's behaviour, but to his willingness to correct it through force. This framework created an environment in which abuse was normalised. Women who were struck by their husbands could not easily appeal to local authorities, let alone expect justice. The idea that a wife might have rights, legal, bodily, or otherwise, ran contrary to the broader belief that her role was one of submission and obedience. A woman who complained too loudly risked social ostracism, religious condemnation, or even further punishment at home. In ecclesiastical courts, the church occasionally intervened in extreme cases of domestic violence, but rarely took the wife's side outright. Priests might counsel moderation or urge reconciliation, but the emphasis was on maintaining the marriage, not protecting the wife. A woman could be advised to be more patient, less argumentative, or more diligent in her household duties. Her suffering was framed as spiritual trial, not a violation of her person. Compounding the issue was the lack of safe recourse. A woman who left an abusive husband had virtually no legal protections. She could be ordered to return. If she fled, she might be viewed as a runaway or a scandalous figure. If she sought shelter with her family, they might refuse to receive her, fearing dishonour or reprisal. For most women, staying and enduring was the only viable option. Leaving meant risking homelessness, starvation, or being branded unchaste. This wasn't a problem limited to rural or poor communities. Even in cities and among the merchant classes, physical punishment within marriage was often considered routine. Manuals on house management sometimes included advice on when and how to discipline wives. Such practices were passed down through generations, reinforced by social norms and religious doctrine alike. Notably, women sometimes internalized these expectations in letters, diaries, and court testimonies from the later medieval period. Some women expressed shame not at being beaten, but at having provoked their husbands. They had been raised to believe that their behaviour could justify violence, and that enduring it silently was a sign of moral strength. Others, of course, resisted, but quietly and with great risk. There are rare accounts of women defending themselves or fleeing in secret, but these were exceptions. The overwhelming majority had no choice but to endure. The cultural landscape did not shift meaningfully until well after the medieval period. Laws slowly began to recognise the possibility of spousal abuse as a crime in the early modern era, but even then, enforcement was spotty. For centuries, the legal system aligned with the social one. The husband's authority was sacrosanct, and the wife's safety was secondary. In the medieval home, the line between discipline and violence was blurred by design. And so, for many women, marriage was not a refuge. It was a place where pain was expected and silence was survival. For a woman trapped in an abusive marriage in medieval Europe, the grim truth was that escape was nearly impossible. The home offered no sanctuary. The family might not welcome her. The laws, both secular and religious, were more likely to return her to her husband than to offer protection. In a world that prioritised marital stability over individual safety, the abused wife had few allies and even fewer options. The structure of medieval society was deeply patriarchal. Authority ran from the king to the lords, from the priests to the parishioners, from husbands to wives. A woman's role was defined by obedience, not autonomy. As a result, systems of support for abused women were virtually non-existent. If a woman fled a violent home, there were few doors she could knock on, and fewer that would open. Extended family, often idealised in modern thinking as a safety net, could not be relied upon. In many cases, a woman's natal family had already transferred responsibility to the husband through marriage. Her dowry had been paid, her guardianship relinquished. To take her back was to admit that the match had failed, something many families, especially among the lower and middle classes, could not afford financially or socially. Moreover, assisting a runaway wife could bring reputational damage, legal trouble, or retaliation from the husband. Church institutions, which claimed moral authority, offered little in the way of intervention. Priests were likely to counsel reconciliation rather than separation. A woman might confess the abuse during penance, hoping for understanding or instruction, but the advice would rarely include leaving. Instead, she might be told to pray more, serve more faithfully, or work harder to please her husband. Her suffering was framed not as injustice, but as part of the divine order, a test of faith or the wages of sin. Even monastic communities were not a true refuge. Entry into a convent was expensive and heavily regulated. A woman who tried to join without a dowry or permission risked rejection. Nuns were expected to live under strict rules and were often barred from sheltering runaway wives. While some religious sanctuary to desperate women, they were not safe havens in the modern sense. And even if accepted temporarily, a woman could still be legally compelled to return to her husband if he came searching. Secular courts, meanwhile, were not designed to handle domestic disputes in favour of the wife. The prevailing legal framework across Europe treated the household as the jurisdiction of the husband. Barring severe injury or death, officials were unlikely to intervene in marital violence. Some towns and manorial courts might issue small fines for excessive beating, but these were rare and more symbolic than protective. A woman could not easily press charges, nor was there a legal mechanism for enforcing long-term separation without church involvement. In some regions, local customs allowed for informal community intervention. Neighbours might step in if a beating became too loud or public. But these efforts were inconsistent. Intervention depended on sympathy, timing, and local culture. Some communities viewed abuse as a private matter, not to be interfered with. Others blamed the woman for speaking out or for failing to behave properly. The burden of proof was on her, and the risk of shame was high. This lack of institutional support created a chilling effect. Women learned to keep silent, to endure quietly, to normalise the violence. Publicly accusing one's husband could backfire. He might be fined, yes, but she might be beaten worse for the embarrassment. Word travelled fast in villages and towns. A woman labelled difficult or disobedient could find herself isolated even from other women. Rumours could damage her children's marriage prospects. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was a form of self-preservation. Only a tiny minority of women found ways to escape permanently. Some fled under cover of darkness to distant towns where they could start over under false names. Others disguised themselves or sought employment in religious households far from home. These stories exist, but they are rare. Most did not run because there was nowhere to go. The system was stacked against her. The household was his domain. The law was his shield. And her suffering, while known, was accepted. Even if a medieval woman managed to survive her husband's physical violence or avoid the worst of it, she had little recourse when the abuse came in quieter forms. Coldness, humiliation, verbal degradation, or isolation, these left no bruises and thus no evidence. They weren't considered matters of justice. In fact, they weren't even considered abuse. There was no concept of emotional cruelty as we understand it today. Medieval courts, whether secular or ecclesiastical, dealt in visible harms and clear violations: trespass, theft, adultery, heresy, and murder. The inner world of a marriage, its affection or lack thereof, its emotional tenor, was considered private and largely irrelevant to legal or moral authorities. A woman who was routinely insulted, neglected, or treated with disdain by her husband had no grounds for complaint that would be recognised or acted upon. From the Church's perspective, love in marriage was desirable but not required. Obedience and duty came first. Marriage was a spiritual institution designed to prevent sin and produce children, not an emotional partnership. If affection developed, it was seen as a bonus, not an expectation. Sermons urged husbands to be firm and fair, but rarely tender. The emotional well-being of wives was not a common subject of concern in ecclesiastical writings. In fact, most theological discourse emphasised the importance of a wife's humility and silence. If a woman complained about her husband's tone or attitude, she risked being viewed as prideful, quarrelsome, or even sinful. Her role was to endure discomfort with grace. In literature and religious texts, the model wife was patient and forgiving, not assertive or outspoken. A man who ignored his wife or mocked her was at worst a flawed husband, not a cruel one. There was no mechanism to hold him accountable. Secular law offered no better protection. Medieval courts were focused on property, contracts, and public order. Emotional pain did not rise to the level of judicial interest unless it caused a public scandal or involved infidelity, and even then the damage was framed in terms of honour or property, not psychological harm. A husband who belittled his wife, withheld affection, or isolated her from family or friends would not be brought before a judge, unless she retaliated, in which case she might be. This legal and cultural indifference extended even to extreme emotional conditions. A woman could live with a husband who denied her food except for what she cooked, who never spoke to her except to issue commands, who ridiculed her appearance or upbringing in front of others, and no authority would intervene. In some cases, neighbours might notice, friends or servants might sympathise, but there was no outlet for relief, no language in the law or theology to name what she was experiencing as harm. What made emotional cruelty so dangerous was precisely its invisibility. It could wear down a woman's sense of worth, isolate her from community, and break her spirit without leaving a mark. Over time, many women accepted this as normal. After all, they had never seen another model. Their mothers, sisters, and neighbours lived similar lives. Affection was a luxury few expected. If their husbands didn't hit them, drink away their wages, or sleep around publicly, they were often considered lucky. In some elite households, noble women might suffer emotional cruelty under the added weight of public expectations. A neglected wife of a lord or knight might be paraded at feasts and expected to perform hospitality while being privately ignored or mocked. Her feelings, again, were irrelevant. Her function, to maintain the household and bear heirs, took precedence. Even queens faced this reality. Medieval chronicles are filled with stories of royal wives who were sidelined, slandered, or emotionally abandoned, yet remained bound to their husbands by law, duty, and the church. Without vocabulary, recognition, or protection, emotional suffering remained unspoken. It did not count. It was not evidence. It was not abuse in the eyes of those who could act. In the medieval world, kindness in marriage was not promised, and cruelty, so long as it left no visible scars, was simply not something the law cared to see. If emotional pain and private cruelty were invisible to the church, responded not with outrage but with instruction, and that instruction was clear: endure. In medieval Europe, the church held extraordinary authority over both public life and personal morality. And when it came to marriage, that authority was heavily tilted in favour of permanence, hierarchy and sacrifice, particularly from women. Marriage, in the eyes of church doctrine, was a sacred bond. By the 12th century, it had been formalised as one of the 7 sacraments, placing it in the same spiritual category as baptism and the Eucharist. This elevated status came with an expectation that marriage was lifelong and indissoluble. And because it was seen as a spiritual contract, one made before God, it wasn't something a person could walk away from, not without endangering their soul. This belief shaped everything that followed. When wives complained of hardship, neglect, or even abuse, priests didn't offer escape, they offered reminders. Women were encouraged to pray for patience, to model their suffering after saints and martyrs, to see endurance as a divine calling. Pain was not merely tolerated, it was sanctified. The Virgin Mary was upheld as the ideal woman, silent, obedient, long-suffering. Her image was used not only to promote piety, but to reinforce gender expectations within marriage. Like Mary, women were meant to accept their roles quietly, without question or complaint. Sermons emphasized that wives owed submission to their husbands, as the church submits to Christ. Any failure in obedience could be interpreted as moral failure, regardless of the husband's behavior. In practice, this meant that even women enduring emotional or physical harm were often told to reflect on their own shortcomings. Had they been argumentative, neglectful in their duties, too prideful? The burden of harmony in marriage fell squarely on their shoulders. Rather than intervening against a cruel husband, the church often counselled the wife to work harder to please him. This approach was deeply embedded in religious teaching materials of the time. Confession manuals, used to guide priests in hearing confessions and giving penance, emphasised the sin of nagging or rebellious wives more than any concern about the conduct of their husbands. Obedience, humility and silence were virtues to be cultivated. Seeking separation, even in extreme cases, was seen as a last resort and often met with resistance from clergy. Endurance was framed not only as the right path, but as the holy one. Some priests described marriage as a purifying fire, a place where a woman's soul could be refined through patience and suffering. The message was clear: earthly misery might lead to heavenly reward. A woman who bore her hardships with grace would earn favour in the afterlife, even if she never found relief in this one. This mindset wasn't confined to the clergy. It filtered into the laity through preaching, festivals, mystery plays and religious texts. Women learned from a young age that suffering in silence was a mark of moral strength. Those who endured without complaint were praised. Those who fought back were suspect. Even when women did manage to secure temporary separations, rare and hard-won, they were often seen as failures, their virtue questioned. Of course, not all clergy were blind to injustice. There are scattered records of priests who intervened in abusive marriages or offered sympathy to suffering wives. Some monasteries took in battered women, at least temporarily. But these were exceptions, not norms. The dominant message from the pulpit was not justice, it was endurance. By upholding this framework, the church reinforced a marital structure that left women spiritually trapped. Abuse was reframed as a cross to bear. Kindness from a husband was optional. Obedience from a wife was mandatory. And in the face of suffering, the woman's duty was to pray, not to leave. In this system, divine virtue and human silence went hand in hand. And as long as the church preached endurance, suffering in marriage remained not just acceptable, but holy. In medieval marriage, even the moments of intimacy carried weighty consequences, chief among them the nearly constant risk of pregnancy. Birth control, as we understand it today, did not exist. While folk remedies, charms, and herbal concoctions circulated among women, none offered reliable protection. And so, for married women, sexual relations with their husbands often meant facing one pregnancy after another, with little chance to rest or recover in between. This cycle wasn't merely exhausting, it was dangerous. The church taught that procreation was the primary purpose of marriage. Every act of intercourse was supposed to be open to the possibility of children. Any effort to prevent conception, whether by physical means, herbal methods, or withdrawal, was discouraged at best and condemned at worst. While some forms of contraception were practiced quietly among women, especially in urban centres or among the poor, the official doctrine left no room for spacing children or limiting family size. As a result, many women found themselves pregnant again within months of giving birth. The toll this took on the body was severe. Pregnancy after pregnancy, with little nutrition, no prenatal care, and the expectation to maintain full household duties, led to chronic fatigue, illness, and often early death. Maternal mortality rates were high. Infections, obstructed labour, hemorrhaging, and complications from malnourishment were common. Even successful deliveries didn't guarantee survival for long. Adding to the strain was the care of existing children. Medieval mothers were expected to feed, clothe, and raise their young, often several at a time, while pregnant or recovering from childbirth. If they had daughters old enough to help, some relief could be found. But for many, especially among peasants and the working poor, there was no choice but to push through illness, pain, and exhaustion to keep the household functioning. Infant mortality added another layer of heartbreak. A woman might give birth to 10 children over her lifetime, but lose several to disease or malnutrition before they reached adolescence. The grief was compounded by physical depletion, and yet there was little time or space to mourn. A new pregnancy might already be underway. This constant cycle of childbearing shaped nearly every aspect of a woman's life. It determined her health, her economic status, and her emotional well-being. It also limited her autonomy. The sheer biological toll of repeated pregnancies kept many women dependent on husbands, family, or community for survival. It made escape from an unhappy or abusive marriage even less likely, and it diminished the chances that a woman could support herself if left alone. Among the elite, the pressures were no less intense, though for different reasons. Noble women were expected to produce heirs, ideally sons. A marriage without children was seen as a failure, and blame typically fell on the wife. If a noble woman did not become pregnant within a reasonable time, her family might face disgrace. In extreme cases, a marriage could be annulled on grounds of infertility. These expectations created a climate of anxiety, in which women were measured by their reproductive performance. Yet even successful childbirth brought no guarantee of respect or reprieve. Women who bore many children were often celebrated in name but not in care. Their health declined early, their roles confined to child-rearing and household management. Their husbands might seek companionship elsewhere, leaving them to raise large families alone or with the help of servants if they were lucky. Folk medicine and traditional knowledge offered some hope of fertility control. Certain herbs like pennyroyal, rue, or mugwort were believed to prevent or terminate pregnancy. But the dosages were uncertain, the risks high, and the knowledge unevenly distributed. Some women died from using such remedies. Others found they didn't work at all. And because church authorities viewed these methods as immoral or even heretical, practicing them carried spiritual and social danger. Ultimately, the lack of effective birth control meant that love in marriage could not be separated from risk. Every touch could carry a cost. And that cost was borne almost entirely by the woman, physically, emotionally, and often fatally. The risks of medieval pregnancy didn't end with labour, they culminated there. For many women, childbirth wasn't just painful, it was deadly. Death in childbirth was an ever-present possibility, so common that it was met with resigned silence rather than shock. It was the unspoken cost of marriage, woven deeply into the fabric of everyday life. By the standards of the time, even a normal birth was grueling. Women gave birth at home, often in cramped, dim spaces. There were no hospitals for the poor, no trained doctors available to most. Midwives, some experienced, others less so, handled deliveries using a combination of practical knowledge, folk tradition, and trial and error. Cleanliness, by modern standards, was non-existent. Tools and cloths were reused. Infection set in quickly. Puerperal fever, caused by bacteria introduced during labour, could kill within days. There was little doctors could do. Even when physicians were called, their treatments might involve bleeding, applying herbal poultices, or offering prayers. In the end, survival depended largely on the woman's own strength and luck. If labour was prolonged, or the baby positioned poorly, there were no cesarean sections, not the survivable kind. A difficult birth could become a death sentence. These were not rare tragedies. They were expected outcomes. A young bride, especially one entering into marriage around puberty, might be pregnant by 15 and dead by 25. A mother of many children, already worn down by years of hard labour and malnutrition, might not make it through her 8th or 9th delivery. Women often made wills while pregnant, anticipating the worst. Clergy was summoned to administer last rites if a birth dragged on too long. And then there was the aftermath. If a woman died in childbirth, her newborn might die too, especially without breast milk or proper care. Husbands remarried quickly, not always out of indifference, but out of necessity. There were more mouths to feed, more heirs to produce. The widowhood of men was brief. The memory of the dead mother faded as the cycle began again with a new wife. There were no monuments, no mourning rituals that honoured these losses with any permanence. Death in childbirth was not scandalous, it was ordinary, and for medieval women, it was one of the most terrifying truths of married life. Even when childbirth ended in survival, joy was not guaranteed, especially if the baby was a girl. In medieval households, the birth of a son was a celebrated event. The birth of a daughter, while often met with polite welcome, lacked the same enthusiasm. A woman's labour, long and dangerous, might be met with disappointment simply because of the baby's sex. This was not just social preference, it was economic and legal reality. Sons carried family names. They inherited land, titles and trades. They represented security, lineage and labour. A son could plough the field, train as an apprentice, defend the household and provide for ageing parents. In elite families, sons meant dynastic power and political leverage. Their value was visible and measurable. Daughters, by contrast, were seen as future expenses. For most families, a girl's path was marriage, and marriage meant dowries. Even modest unions required some transfer of goods, livestock or coin. For wealthier families, dowries were larger and more burdensome. The more daughters a household had, the more resources were drained, preparing them for futures that did not return assets to the natal family. A daughter's labour might help in the home or in the fields while she remained unmarried, but long-term she was destined to leave. This imbalance shaped how children were received and raised. Sons were taught to lead, to inherit, and to speak with authority. Daughters were taught to serve, obey, and remain within domestic roles. This division began in infancy. Celebrations were more robust for boys, baptisms more elaborate, gifts more generous. Even in peasant homes where practical survival took priority, the hope for a son was ever present. Some mothers tried to shield their daughters from this dynamic, but there was only so much they could do within a system that viewed females as less valuable from birth. A mother who had borne several daughters without a son might be blamed for failing, and that her husband or treated with quiet pity. Her daughters, too, would feel the difference in how they were treated compared to their brothers. Love for daughters certainly existed, but the broader society didn't reward it. In a world where everything, property, power and legacy passed through the male line, joy at birth was not a universal experience. It depended on the gender of the child. In a world where children were valued differently depending on their gender, and where every birth carried risk, the pain of pregnancy loss often passed unnoticed. Miscarriages were common in the medieval period due to malnutrition, illness, poor sanitation and overwork. But unlike deaths that occurred after birth, a miscarriage was rarely recognised with ceremony or support. It was a private sorrow, one women carried largely on their own. There were no medical explanations, no counselling, and no cultural space for grieving what had not yet fully arrived. A woman who miscarried was expected to recover and move on physically, emotionally and socially. If she had other children, they needed care. If she didn't, her primary role as a wife to produce offspring remained unfulfilled. The loss, rather than being met with comfort, might be met with silence or subtle judgment. Superstition sometimes made things worse. Miscarriages were occasionally seen as divine punishment or the result of a woman's failure to follow religious or moral expectations. If a woman had strayed from fasting rules, failed to attend church regularly, or even experienced strong emotional fear, the blame for the loss might fall squarely on her shoulders. This sense of guilt, layered atop grief, made the experience deeply isolating. Among noble families, where heirs were a matter of inheritance and political alliance, miscarriage carried high stakes. A noblewoman who lost a pregnancy might face pressure or suspicion from her husband's kin. Repeated losses could threaten her status or lead to questions about her fitness as a wife. Yet even under these pressures, open mourning was rare. The loss of a potential heir was acknowledged, but the emotional toll on the woman was not. For peasant women, there was no time or room to grieve. Life moved forward quickly and harshly. A miscarriage didn't lessen the demands of work or child-rearing. It didn't earn time off from tending animals, hauling water, or preparing food. The pain, both physical and emotional, was absorbed into daily life. In medieval marriage, the emotional costs of reproduction were invisible to those who didn't bear them. Miscarriages left no social imprint. But for the women who experienced them, the grief was real. It simply had no place to go. After the emotional weight of childbirth, miscarriages, and the everyday toll of a marriage built on duty, it becomes clearer why love rarely sat at the centre of medieval unions. Romance, when it existed, was a fortunate accident, not the foundation. Most people didn't marry for love. They married because they had to. Among the nobility, marriage was political. Families sought to secure power, land and alliances. A couple might meet on their wedding day, and their personal preferences were irrelevant. The feelings of the bride and groom had no bearing on the agreement. A strategic match was valued above all else. If affection bloomed later, it was tolerated or even praised, but it was never the goal. Among peasants and townsfolk, economics shaped most matches. A family needed help on the farm, a son needed a dowry to start his own household, or a widow needed protection. Emotional compatibility was a luxury few could afford. Community gossip might influence who ended up together, but the underlying motivators remained practical. A stable household required cooperation, not necessarily love. The church encouraged this view. Passion was regarded with suspicion. Lust, even between spouses, was to be moderated. Love in marriage was acceptable, even commendable, but never as important as piety and obedience. Marriage, in religious terms, was a tool to avoid sin and raise children within Christian values, not a pursuit of personal happiness. Literature and song from the period paint a revealing contrast. Courtly love, idealized, poetic and forbidden, existed outside of marriage. Troubadours sang of longing and romantic suffering, but rarely within the context of a spouse. The very idea of passionate equal love inside a marriage was treated as a fantasy. Real marriage was work, transaction and endurance. Some couples, of course, grew fond of each other. Shared years, struggles and children could create bonds. But these were often retrospective comforts, not the reasons for marrying in the first place. Affection might develop, but it didn't shape the structure of the institution. The idea of marrying for love as a default was centuries away from becoming a common practice. In medieval times, love stories were told, sung and dreamed, but rarely lived through the marriage bed. For most, love was the exception. Marriage was the rule. The romantic stories we tell today of soulmates, passionate weddings and happily ever afters are not based on medieval reality. In fact, they were invented centuries later, often as nostalgic fantasies that bore little resemblance to the hard truth of marriage in the Middle Ages. Real medieval unions were shaped by duty, hierarchy and survival, not magic or mutual affection. The fairy tale version of love, the kind where a poor girl marries a prince or a brave knight wins a maiden's hand, came out of later literature and folklore, especially during the early modern period. By then, marriage was starting to be reshaped by new cultural ideals, and authors began reimagining the past through a rosier lens. They gave medieval characters the emotions and choices that real medieval people rarely had. In reality, medieval marriages didn't provide the narrative arcs that fairy tales required. There was little agency, especially for women. Children were promised young, many never chose their spouses, and feelings were secondary to economics and alliances. Weddings were often solemn and short. There were no grand romantic gestures. A feast might follow, but not a honeymoon. Even the most famous medieval stories of love and chivalry, like Tristan and Isolde or Lancelot and Guinevere, were usually about love outside of marriage. The passion was forbidden, tragic, or unattainable. These tales captivated audiences precisely because they did not reflect ordinary married life. In fact, they worked so well as stories because they highlighted how rare and difficult love could be in the context of duty and tradition. The average person in the medieval period would not have seen marriage as a romantic fulfillment. It was a social expectation, a religious responsibility, and often an economic trap. While companionship might emerge over time, affection was a bonus, not a promise. The fairy tales came later because people longed for what they didn't have. As societies evolved and the idea of love-based marriage took hold, older eras were recast as enchanted. Castles, gowns, and knights made for rich imagery. But those medieval marriages, arranged, imbalanced, and often loveless, had little in common with the fairy tale endings they supposedly inspired. In truth, the Middle Ages gave us few love stories worth repeating, and most real-life marriages would never make it into a bedtime story. For all the volumes written about medieval kings, knights, and noblemen, there remains a stark absence in the historical record. The voices of the women who lived, worked, married, and died under the weight of medieval expectations. Most of what we know about marriage in the Middle Ages comes from legal documents, church records, or male-authored chronicles, none of which fully reflect the lived experiences of the women involved. Their stories, if they were ever told at all, were rarely written down. This silence wasn't accidental. Literacy was largely restricted to the upper classes, and even then, men dominated education. Noble women were more likely to be literate than peasant women, but their writings, when they survived, often focused on religious devotion or household management, not personal reflection. For most medieval women, even those with wealth or status, private thoughts about marriage, love, disappointment, or grief went unrecorded. The Church, the main keeper of written knowledge, viewed women's roles in marriage through a theological lens. Obedience, chastity, and endurance were emphasized. If a woman suffered in marriage, it was framed as a spiritual trial, not a social injustice. Confession might have offered some outlet, but it left no trace. The pain and resilience of millions of women disappeared with them. Legal records sometimes hint at these untold lives, women petitioning for annulment, reporting abuse, or being named in inheritance disputes. But even these accounts are filtered through male scribes and judges. The emotions behind the events are lost. A widow's remarriage may be recorded, but not the grief that came before. A dowry agreement might survive, but not the reluctance of the girl it bound. Folk songs and oral traditions preserved fragments of female experience, ballads of betrayal, laments for lost children, tales of longing, but these were passed down informally, shaped by generations, and often altered to fit the morals of the time. Few were ever written. Fewer still survived. What remains, then, is a distorted picture. Medieval marriage is often understood through male perspectives. Kings securing alliances, fathers managing property, scholars debating doctrine. But the women who lived inside these marriages, their hopes, compromises, and quiet suffering, left behind little more than shadows. This silence is its own legacy. It reminds us that history isn't just about what was recorded. It's about who was allowed to speak and who was not. Medieval women, especially within marriage, lived deeply human lives. They just weren't the ones writing the stories. Despite the burdens, silences, and structural injustice that framed medieval marriage, women endured. Not because they were passive or resigned, but because endurance was often the only path available. Within a system built to favour men, one where law, land, and literacy rarely belonged to them, women navigated survival through patience, resourcefulness, and sheer will. Their strength was rarely celebrated. It didn't appear in chronicles or epic poems. There were no medals for a woman who gave birth 10 times and buried half her children. No songs for the peasant wife who managed a household alone while her husband went to war or vanished in debt. No tribute to the girl who married a stranger at 14 and spent the rest of her life working beside him in silence. But strength wasn't absent. It just looked different. It was found in daily routines carried out without fail. In bread baked before dawn, water hauled over frost-hardened ground, and wounds tended without complaint. It lived in lullabies, whispered beside hearths, in the teaching of prayers and spindle work, and in the subtle defiance of passing on knowledge not written in burned through living. Some women found small ways to reclaim agency. A wife might quietly trade goods behind her husband's back to support a struggling neighbour. A midwife might share her herbal knowledge to protect a girl from another unwanted pregnancy. A widow might refuse to remarry, choosing hard independence over another round of submission. These choices weren't always recorded, but they happened, in kitchens, fields and alleys, far from the parchment and pens of clerks. Endurance didn't mean agreement. Women questioned their roles, grieved their losses and sometimes resisted, even if history didn't catch them in the act. Their stories weren't less real for being unwritten. They simply weren't granted the status of history at the time. Even in noble circles, where women had more visibility, endurance took on different forms. A noblewoman might use her limited influence to shape household policy, protect her children's inheritance, or maneuver behind the scenes during power struggles. Their impact was subtle, often invisible, but essential to the functioning of noble estates and even kingdoms. It's tempting to look back at medieval marriage with modern eyes and ask why women didn't fight harder, speak louder, or demand better. But to live in that world was to operate within limits we can scarcely imagine. Speaking out could mean exile or worse. Refusing a marriage could lead to poverty or imprisonment. Choice was not equally distributed, neither was safety. And yet, within those constraints, women found ways to persist. They raised generations, they preserved traditions, they kept families and communities intact through war, famine, and plague. They carried knowledge forward, they held memory when the records did not. So while medieval marriage may have been unfair, unbalanced, and often harsh, it also revealed something powerful: the endurance of women in a system that gave them few advantages and little credit. That endurance is not the same as approval. It's a testament to survival. They may not have written the stories, but they lived them, and they mattered. And so, dear listener, we reach the end of our tale. A tale not of fairy godmothers, ballrooms, or kisses that broke curses, but of real lives lived under hard skies, within narrow roles and behind closed wooden doors. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't made for love. It was built to hold land, to produce heirs, to forge alliances, and to maintain order. It was a system that served the church, the nobility, and the economy far more than it served the hearts of the people inside it, especially the women. They were promised young before they could choose, wed to men they barely knew, made to bear children with no guarantee they would survive, and all the while expected to obey, to forgive, to endure. Abuse wasn't punished. Infidelity wasn't even hidden. Divorce was nearly impossible, and sympathy was in short supply. And yet, they lived those lives with strength. They found moments of joy where they could, in the laughter of children, in a warm bowl of stew after a long day, in small, stolen conversations with sisters and neighbours. They leaned on one another when the rules bent against them. They shared remedies, old songs, whispered advice. They turned suffering into survival and silence into something quietly powerful. We'll never know the names of most of them. Their words weren't written down, their stories didn't make it into the histories, but their footprints were left behind, in cottage floors, in worn tools, in the hands of daughters who kept going. And slowly over time, things began to change. Not quickly, not easily. But one generation at a time, the idea that love could matter, that partnership could be mutual, that marriage might one day be chosen, grew. So tonight, as you close your eyes and drift into sleep, remember this: the past wasn't fair, it wasn't gentle, and for many it wasn't full of love. But those who lived it, especially the women, carried far more than we'll ever know, not in grand gestures, but in quiet endurance, in holding things together when nothing else did. Their lives weren't fairy tales, but they were real. And sometimes that matters more. Now rest well wherever you are. You've travelled far tonight through fields and keeps and candlelit kitchens, through contracts and customs and stories half forgotten. Let them settle, let them soften. And if you're still awake, thank you for listening. Sleep deeply, dream gently, and come back next time for another true tale from a time that wasn't kind, but always human. Good night.